Okay, hi. So, wow, where do I start? How to read a book. A fitting start to a channel that's called All About Book Summaries, I suppose. Yeah, so I've got the 1972 edition here with me. Um, yeah, I was looking at some of the reviews of this book on Goodreads, and yeah, I was very hurt. Yeah, well, not hurt. I mean, but you know what I mean, right? I was surprised. I was taken aback about some of the things that were said about it, and it was like, it was like someone was insulting your close friend or something. Although I totally understand, the complaints that some people had, right? They said the writing is a bit archaic. Fair enough. I mean, it was first written in 1940, updated in 1972. And they said that the author, that was another recurring criticism, the author just says he, right? Pretty much all the time. I think there's one time where he says men and women. Um, but, it's always the author, he, the reader, he. Um, which is fair enough, I suppose. But I mean, if we can get past that, I think this is a great book. I've personally read it three times. Right, I usually for this channel I usually read things twice. So I read the book first to get to get a general sense of what's going on, to understand its structure, its argument. And then the second time I read it, that's when I write these summaries. So I've read this three times, and I can easily see myself, reading it many more times. So yeah, we're kicking this channel off with one of my favorite books, and I think a pretty fitting one, right? Given the content of this channel. Okay, so let's see, what do I have here? Yeah, so I'm dealing with the 1972 edition, not the 1940 one. I haven't read the 1940 book. Sorry, I don't even have it. But what I sort of inferred from the preface and other things is that the latest edition focuses more on nonfiction than fiction. Also, the authors in this one take a crack at speed reading, which was relatively new back then. Um, and they claim that, and this still stands in my opinion, they claim that its main flaw lies in promoting fast reading across all sectors, right? This is something I still teach with the SAT, right? That it's not about being fast, it's not about being slow, it's about knowing what to read at what speed, right? There are passages, there are parts of a book where you should be reading slowly. There are parts where you should be reading at an average pace, and there are chunks where you should be reading more quickly. And we'll get to those in due time. Um, so what about their aim, right? Why did the authors? They're two authors, by the way. A famous, well, yeah, reasonably famous philosopher who was also an editor of the Encyclopedia Britannica in the 60s, I believe. His name is Mortimer J. Adler. Um, and also the infamous Charles Van Doren. Interesting people in their own right. If you feel like it, look them up. Charles Van Doren was an exalted professor at Columbia University who lost his post because of a scandal. And I shall not tell you more. If you're curious, I mean, this isn't about them, but still, right? So, anyway, their aim can sort of be garnered from their lament, right? So even back in the 1970s, so again, 1972, they argue that at least as far back as the 1930s, institutions were not teaching students the necessary skills to analyze properly, right? They were just teaching basic elementary reading and only up to like the sixth grade or something. Um, that's their claim. So yeah, the book is an attempt to rectify that. Um, yeah, and I think in this day, I mean, I think in this day and age, the message is still, and the aim and their approach, they're all still very, very viable, right? They're still very valid, because, yeah, few people can think for themselves, right? I don't think, I mean, this has gotten worse with, you name it, right? Social media, easier and cheaper distractions, video games, which weren't around back then, Netflix, YouTube, you name it, right? I mean, YouTube is a bit of a double-edged sword. You can use it to waste time, or you can use it for useful stuff like this. But yeah, so I think this book is still, not only extremely important, but more so than ever, in my opinion. The book is chiefly divided into four sections, right? Each one representing a level of reading. So the first one is elementary reading, which obviously doesn't get much attention, and rightly so, right? If you're reading a book about reading, then you should be past the elementary level. So that's only given like several pages, no more. Okay. The second section, the second section is called inspectional reading, and this is where they teach you how to skim and scan, but with purpose, right? We'll go into that a bit. The third section is the longest one, and that's the one devoted to analytical reading, which, as the name suggests, it teaches you how to delve deeply into books, right? How to make the most of them. And finally, and this is unique to the book, there's something the authors call syntopical reading. I won't get much into that because it was basically a short-lived failure. The Syntopicon. It sounded good on paper. It was basically a compilation of the greatest ideas in alphabetical order, and the authors were also listed under those in alphabetical order. So whatever, they started with big idea A, which was, I don't know, acceptance, or so. I'm just giving an example, right? C, there could have been colonialism in there. So who are the great, let's go with C. It makes more sense than A. So let's say you're looking for colonialism, right? So who spoke in the Western tradition? Who wrote about colonialism, right? Who's a heavyweight? And you would go to colonialism and you would see the names of the authors and you would see their respective texts, right? So it was all organized there. So Adler's, it was one of the authors, Mortimer J. Adler, who came up with the idea, worked on it for like 10 years. His idea was that I want the Syntopicon to be for ideas what a dictionary is for books. And unfortunately, for several reasons, he failed. Yeah, so anyway, so syntopical reading. Right, so what does this refer to? The adjective, not the noun, not the book. It refers to a type of analysis in which you take different works that are still related, there's some joint themes between them, and through guiding questions that you must come up with, you then compare and contrast two or more texts, right? Where do they agree? Where do they disagree? And what do they agree or disagree on? So do they agree on the aim but disagree on the methods? They agree on the methods, disagree on the aim, disagree on both, agree on both. As well as what is it they're agreeing or disagreeing on. So despite the Syntopicon's failure, I think, this is the ultimate, right? Obviously, you don't have to do this for every text you read. And the authors mentioned that in the book, right? I mean, the guidelines given here are always given to the maximum, right? That doesn't mean for every book you read you have to follow each and every guideline, right? But this is basically the ultimate guide, right? This is what will help you extract the most from your books. So although these four levels of reading are not what the book is wholly based on, they nonetheless form the core part of its content, right? But we'll be looking at other aspects as well, okay, as the summary goes on. I'll be talking about note-taking. I'll be talking about classifying books according to type in order to understand and criticize them fairly. Reading etiquette, talk about that, using reference books, such as dictionaries, as well as other aspects of reading. So stick around, right? As I mentioned in my, welcome to the channel video, this is going to be in depth, right? I'm not going to be reading the book. I'm going to be summarizing it, but it's not going to be, it's going to be an in-depth summary, right? Something you listen to in the car, something something that gives you a good overview of the book without having to read it, right? And it also serves as a refresher in case you've read the book and don't want to read it again. So this is sort of my aim with the channel. Anyway, if you're interested in that, where I talk about the aims of this channel, check out the first video I have up, which welcomes you to the channel, tells you about all that. The book's available on Amazon, so I'll post a link below, and I'm also on Goodreads. So yeah, feel free to add me there. We can chat on Goodreads privately if you want to. I don't mind. YouTube isn't great for sending private messages. I don't like it. It's not well organized. It's not clear. So yeah, Goodreads I think is well, not the best, but certainly easier to to communicate on. And that's it. Thanks for watching this one. Let's get to part 1, chapter 1. Okay, hi, welcome back. So this is Mortimer J. Adler's book and Charles Van Doren's the How to Read a Book. Okay, this is part 1. Part 1 is called The Dimensions of Reading, and we're on chapter 1, called The Activity and Art of Reading. So before we start, again, it's important, I know I've said it in the overview video, but it's important to know what the author set out to do, okay? So the main purpose of this book is to equip serious readers, right, with tools that allow them to gain an increased understanding of the books they read. In other words, its aim is not necessarily to increase the pleasure from or the speed of reading. Okay, so the aim is depth. Okay, depth and analysis. All right, so to begin with, an important distinction must be made between knowledge, i.e. facts, and understanding. Okay, too many facts, the authors argue, can be just as detrimental to understanding as too few. They were, of course, talking about, radio, television. Remember, we're in the early 70s here. But their words, if anything, ring more true now than ever before. The advent of social media has us bombarded with information, and it's difficult to sift through the data and make up our own minds in a satisfactory manner. And that's why I said in my overview video, the book is more important than ever. All right, moving on. Reading cannot be fully passive. So we talk of more active or less active reading. Okay, the more active reader demands more of him or herself and of the text before them. All 4 ways of communication, so listening, speaking, reading, and writing, should ideally be done more actively. A reader depends on a writer, but to a certain extent, the writer also depends on the reader. So for communication to be successful, both must do their part. So how does one become a more active, more demanding reader? Well, that's basically what the entire book is about. The first step to better reading involves expecting and accepting, right? So expecting and accepting that you will not understand the book in its entirety from the first read, okay? And again, I've said in my overview video, I always read any book except fiction, okay? Sometimes I read fiction books more than once, but if it's nonfiction and if I like it, if I feel it's worth summarizing, then I read it at least twice. Okay, in the case of this book, I've read it 3 times. But yeah, you just don't do it, right? I mean, think about it, okay? If you do, right? If you can read a book and understand it entirely from the first read, then that means that you and the author are of a single mind, right? So you may have been following him or her step by step from the get-go, but the author knows or should know more than you, right? At least concerning the topic he or she is writing about, right? So here's the first rule. Read everything that you feel has added or can add value to your understanding of the world at least twice. Okay. Second, and Adler is especially keen on this, do not feel threatened by books that seem too difficult, above your head, as he calls them. Okay, there's some YouTube videos of him where he's conducting an interview, or he's being interviewed actually, and he says that, right? He says that he says that books that are written for the general reader, and most of them are, can be read by those who are willing to put in the effort, right? So not only can be read, but should be read, right? If you read a book and it's too easy, there's no point, right? You should read a book that you feel you have to pull yourself up to be able to understand, a book that challenges you. These are the books that are worth putting effort in. And that brings us to the final point about this first step. Wrestle with a book first as much as you can, right? Depend on your own mind and your own experiences before resorting to, external aid, be it Spark Notes, be it Wikipedia, be it a teacher, even a parent, or a more knowledgeable classmate. It's all too easy now with easy to access and free resources. It's easy to let all of these tools, if you will, do the thinking for us, right? And in the case of people now, it's easier than ever to communicate. Okay, you can send a message to on any platform. So it's easier to communicate with people, and it's easier to find things online. That doesn't mean that there's no downside to this, right? So wrestle with things first before resorting to external aid. Of course, all of this is harder in the sense that it requires more time. So there's no beating around the bush about this. But let me share with you one poignant definition of success that I constantly remind myself of. One difference between successful and unsuccessful people is that the former focus on pleasing outcomes, regardless of the methods involved in acquiring them. Okay, whereas the latter, successful people, they default to easy methods and ignore long-term goals. Okay, sorry, I should have said unsuccessful people. Sorry. Okay, so let me repeat that. Successful people focus on pleasing outcomes. Unsuccessful people focus on pleasing methods. Okay, and they ignore long-term goals. So reading actively, okay, the method that is hard, okay, but the result is a pleasing one that the less active reader cannot possibly enjoy, right? Needless to say, we've been talking about challenging books, okay, books, not magazines, social media posts, and the like, okay? Remember that communication between two unequal people can and does happen. Otherwise, no one learns anything, okay? It is our job to learn who these people are in the fields that concern us and how we can better learn from them. To summarize, there's a difference between reading to know and reading to understand, okay? Knowing is basic awareness, but understanding involves knowing why something is the case, how it relates to other variables, how it's different than or the same as related concepts, and so on. So there's more to it, right? Understanding demands more of you. To further illustrate this, you can remember something you know, right? If you get it on a multiple choice test, you can recognize it. But to explain it fully and simply, you need to truly understand what you're talking about. So, yeah. Keep in mind then that being widely read and being well read are not the same, okay? Quality over quantity. Finally, and this concludes chapter 1, Reading actively should involve the same skills as researching and writing. And I quote, keenness of observation, readily available memory, range of imagination, and of course, an intellect trained in analysis and reflection. Page 14. A book is like a teacher, only an absent one. A living one will most likely, answer your questions. But if you demand answers from a book, you must make the effort to answer them yourself. All right, chapter 2 is next. I'll see you in the next one. Okay, hi. So, welcome back to my channel, all about book summaries. We're doing, we're still in part 1, chapter 2, the levels of reading. And the book is How to Read a Book. So, in this chapter, the 4 levels of reading are introduced in detail. Note the word levels, suggesting that they build and depend on each other. The first is elementary reading, where one learns to read mechanically. The second level is inspectional reading, where a set amount of time is given in order to skim systematically. Skimming is to reading as planning is to writing. The purpose of this pre-reading is to determine what the book is about. Is it useful? Does it serve your purpose as a reader? I.e., is it what you're looking for? One of the main reasons you should not just start reading a book before doing this has to do with the fact that the brain is actually terrible at multitasking. You don't want to be in a situation where you're trying to figure out what kind of book you're reading while simultaneously trying to understand its arguments. Understanding alone is hard enough business. So spare yourself the trouble of juggling several tasks at the same time whenever you can. The third level is called analytical reading. In short, it is the best reading of a single text one is capable of making. And to do so, and this is probably, if not the most important message, it's certainly one of the more important messages, in this book. It's one of the things you should take away. If you forget everything, this is one of the top 5 things you should remember. A good reader asks questions. If you read something and you don't stop and come up with questions and try to answer them, you've not read to your potential. Let's just put it that way. So it's something you must do. Going through a book without asking questions is like going through life without setting goals. You'll never know when and if you have arrived, right? Will the book, you'll never know if the book answered your questions if you didn't pose questions to begin with. I can't stress this enough. True understanding of a book begins with this level, which is discussed in detail in part 2. Syntopical reading discussed in part 4 might also be termed comparative reading. Ideally, though, it goes even beyond that. To engage in this final level of reading, several texts are analyzed, ones that pivot around a common subject or theme. So the question or questions asked of them and the interpretation that ensues may actually go beyond all of them, potentially leading to a novel take on the matter at hand. All right. Chapter 2 was a short one. That's it. I'll see you in the next video. All right. Welcome back to my channel. So we continue on. This is a very short chapter. We're still on part 1, chapter 3. The first level of reading, elementary reading. And the book we're doing is How to Read a Book. So for several reasons, I really don't wish to talk about this chapter extensively. Neither did the authors, for that matter. But a few things are worth mentioning. A lot of people stop at this level of reading. Which is attained around the 10th grade. So in school you're not going to get any better. At this level of reading than more than when you're, 15 or something. Students at this grade level can pretty much read anything. Albeit in a manner that is unsophisticated and lacking profundity. They can manage, they can get by, but no more than that, right? That's what elementary means. Another thing I wanted to mention from personal experience is this. Try to go from whole to parts, right? Especially if you're teaching younger learners or if you tend to become impatient. So what I mean by this is get or provide, if you're teaching someone else, the bigger picture at first and then go into details. Okay? So find something you're interested in, try to read it in full, and afterward break it down. Okay? You'll then have a purpose. Okay? So, yeah, so if you read something, say, if you're not good at French, say, okay, read something you're interested in, no interruptions, no grammar lessons, no pronunciation, okay, read it. That will make you thirsty to know more about it. And then when you do learn about grammar and pronunciation and, right, there's a purpose. You want to learn it to crack that book, to understand it, okay? It's more intuitive for people and it gets them more engaged. Yeah, so you'll then have a purpose. Grammar, for instance, will not feel like suffering, but merely hard work. As I mentioned before, the book, as well as I, assume that you're at least a high school student, right, capable of elementary reading. So let's move on to the next chapter. Hello and welcome back to the channel. We're still on the same book, How to Read a Book, by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. This is chapter 4. We're still in part 1, and it's called The Second Level of Reading, Inspectional Reading. So when it comes to inspectional reading, the first thing to be aware of is that it is made up of 2 parts. Okay, the first part, as mentioned previously, is called skimming or pre-reading. This allows you, among other things, to decide if the book is worth your while or not, right? What the author's, overall argument is, how the book is structured, right? If it seems to agree with or stray from the arguments you've encountered on similar topics and so on. Okay, so skimming should not take plenty of time, okay? And even if you ultimately decide not to read the book you're examining, you usually will have gotten something out of it, okay? No matter how trivial. Here's a guideline concerning skimming. Look at the title page, back page, where a summary usually is, okay? Much shorter than mine, hopefully. And a preface, okay, if it's there, okay? Read these quickly and note any subtitles, okay, especially with older books. But even some new ones, especially self-help books and science books, they tend to have a lot of subtitles, okay? All this will at least allow you to figure out what angle, right, the author is taking on his or her subject, right? And what class of book the text belongs to, okay? Is it philosophy? Is it science? Is it self-help? Is it, okay, literature? Whatever. This will allow you to better analyze it, right? Better compare it, and so on. Okay? 2, study closely the table of contents. Especially in older works, these used to be quite detailed. And single-handedly allow you to form a mental map of the book's content. Okay? Even back in Adler's days, in the early 70s, he was sort of saying that, I've noticed a lot of books now don't have a detailed table of contents, and it was and still is, they do it this way because they want to keep it, hidden. They want to keep the content mysterious, okay? They want you to look at it and not be able to get much out of it, and then you go, you know what, let me read the book so that I can better understand. Then you buy it, then they make money. So, all right, examine the index, right, which is at the end of the book. The benefit of this is that you can get an idea of the breadth or depth of segments covered. It may be too detailed for you, right? It may be, you may know 80% of the words there, which is just fine, and that's what you're looking for. But likewise, maybe you do want something that's detailed, right? So so this is also your chance to look up terms that seem unfamiliar, right? Should you, of course, decide to actually read the book. So you can get a head start on vocabulary that way. So this can therefore indirectly tell you how difficult the book might be or how much time you'll need to read it. If they are there, examine the chapter headings. Also, look at any introductory statements at the beginning or the summarizing remarks toward the end to get a sense of the author's aim. Okay. Again, not all books have them. I've seen this mostly in science books, right? or they sort of summarize at the end. This book summarizes most chapters at the end, so it makes it quite useful, quite organized, refreshes your memory at the end, and yeah, I think it's great. Unfortunately, not all books have this. Finally, choose some pages at random. Okay, remember, we're still skimming. We're still not actually reading the book. Okay, choose some pages at random, read them, right? In whole or in part, okay, especially the last 2 or 3 pages of a book. Why are they important? They're important because more often than not, authors won't be able to resist the urge to summarize their main arguments toward the end, right? They want to make sure if you got to the end that at the very least they refresh your memory, and as tersely as possible tell you what they've been talking about. So all these steps should take no more than an hour. Okay, often less. All right. So keep that in mind. Your skimming shouldn't take more than an hour. That's the maximum. Okay, the maximum it should take. All right. So that was the first part. Okay, 5 things to remember. The second part of inspectional reading is called superficial reading. Okay, do not be misled by the adjective superficial. Okay, it has to do with what I talked about before. Okay, you cannot understand and analyze at the same time, at least not well. So when you're reading a challenging book for the first time, don't worry too much, okay, if you don't understand all of its points profoundly. All right, and do not attempt to analyze from the get-go. All good books must be read at least twice, okay, at least twice. Your aim during the first read is to have a complete picture of the book's points. Only after doing this can you move on to the third level of reading, analytical reading. Okay, so resist the temptation to look things up, be it on dictionary.com, Wikipedia, Google Scholar, Cliff Notes, okay, or whatever. If you do this before exhausting your own mental faculties, you will, without meaning to, be hurting your chances of truly and fully analyzing a book. Okay, because the ideas found on those websites or whatever you consult or whomever you consult, okay, they will color. Okay, they will color your own understanding, and what you'll come up with will not be fully your own. Anyway, let's talk about speed reading, which I sort of mentioned in the overview. Okay, which is talked about in this chapter. Speed reading solves only one type of problem, right? The problem of slowly reading things that ought to be read quickly. But there are many other reading problems, and speed reading is of little use, right, when you apply it as a remedy to those kinds of problems. For instance, not knowing what to look for or how to analyze, right? These are the common problems, right? Given the many distractions around us today, these won't be solved by reading quickly. Okay, it's like you'll be getting to the wrong destination faster. Okay, that's not very helpful, right? If you're not heading toward your desired destination, it doesn't do you much good to get there more quickly, right? What does you good is correcting your course, right? Getting to the right destination. So, yeah, sorry. Okay. Also, some passages are dense, right? Requiring a slow, meticulous pace to allow their full absorption. Okay. Here, needless to say, right? Speed reading is detrimental. It hurts. Okay. So the crucial thing to take away from this then is one needs to identify what needs to be read at what speed. Okay. So in other words, if you're reading everything at the same speed, that means you're saying everything is equally important. And if you think that, then you're not reading well. There's no nice way to say it. Okay, all of this does not mean that speed reading is useless. Okay, it doesn't mean you should just throw it away. Okay, if you want a simple and inexpensive method to do it, here it is. Okay, grab a pen, pencil, whatever. Okay, and use your index finger or any finger you feel comfortable with, and move this device of choice, okay, as you read, and monitor what your normal, comfortable rate of reading is. Okay, so first, without pushing yourself. Okay, Where are you? Okay? How many words per minute can you read? Okay? Comfortably. After you do so, increase the speed at which you move your device very slowly. Okay? But force your eyes to follow nonetheless, even if you're not fully comfortable, and you won't be. Right? The point is to push yourself, right? To get yourself, oh, okay, I'm still alive. To get yourself out of the comfort zone. Okay? So it will be hard at first. So do it slowly, do it incrementally. Okay? Force your eyes to follow. All right? Yeah, the key word here is slightly, slowly. Okay, otherwise you'll just become frustrated. Bit by bit, when you're comfortable with, the 5% faster reading speed, okay, that you've added, or whatever it is, okay, increase that. When you're comfortable with it, with 5%, increase it again until you reach your limit. Okay, this also has the added effect of keeping you more focused. Okay, because it's more difficult for your mind to wander if it has to follow that pen or pencil or whatever it is. It'll be harder for it to wander. Okay, so you'll be increasing your focus as well as your speed. Note, however, that concentration is only part of what you need to fully analyze a book. Okay, if you don't have the right tools, even if you're fully focused, you're not going to get the results you want, right? That satisfaction of delving deeply into a book. So remember, read as slowly as need be and as quickly as you can while retaining comprehension. Okay. Also, pre-read a book even if you plan on reading it in full. Okay, this is important. I may have given the impression that only skim a book if you don't plan on reading it in full. Okay. No, even if you plan on reading it, even if if it's required reading from university, or, if it's a book you've heard of and you want to read regardless, it's still useful to skim it. Okay. Finally, do not be put off by difficult passages on the first read. Okay. Any worthwhile book, you're not going to understand it and analyze it fully from your first read. Okay. Read a book superficially the first time around. That's basically it. Okay. The next chapter, chapter 5, talks about the demands an active reader places on the text before him or her. So I'll see you in the next video for chapter 5. Okay. Hello. So this is the last chapter in part 1. Chapter 5, demanding reader. Of course, we're doing the book, How to Read a Book. Okay, first of all, this chapter, and indeed the book in general, focuses on nonfiction, okay, i.e. practical expository books. Books, not texts in general, okay, but books specifically. That's the focus. Active readers of such books ask questions they then seek to answer. As I told you, this is one of the pillars of this book, okay? If you don't remember anything from this summary, please remember this. Active readers of books ask questions they then seek to answer. Okay? There are 4 main, pretty self-explanatory questions such readers ask. Okay? So, they're a great place. These are obviously not the only questions you can and probably should ask. Okay? Again, this is the book is a general guideline. Okay? But this is and this is a good start. Okay? So, first question you should ask about any book is, what is the book about as a whole? Right? So, in other words, what are the main arguments and what are their respective subcategories? Okay? If you claim that you have read a book well, you must be able to answer this question. Okay? Question number 2, what is being said in detail and how? Okay? Question 3, is the book true in whole or in part? And 4, what of it? Right? In other words, what is the significance of what you've just read? If you've understood and accepted what the author said, so what? Right? So what should you change? Right? What should you do? All right. Keep in mind that if you ask no questions, right, you will get no answers. Okay? So asking these questions must become a habit. Okay? you must have a system in place, okay, as you're reading books, okay. I use, my laptop, okay. I have, what is it called? Microsoft OneNote. Yeah. Okay, that's where I write my summaries on. I have Goodreads, which sort of helps me keep organized. But that's not really where I answer these questions. Sometimes I type out what I think, in terms of reviews. Um, yeah, I have folders where I put all this stuff, right, with the images. Okay, I have a system. Okay, I also write on the book itself. Okay, I don't know if you can see. Okay, for instance, here, I've underlined stuff in blue. I write in red the words I'm not fully comfortable with, or sometimes I know the word in context, but I don't know how to use it. Sometimes, uh, I haven't even heard of it. And I also write notes. Okay, so that's my way. Okay, other people like to have a notebook. Okay, some people like to keep their books pristine. I have a friend, I have a couple of friends like that. When I tell them, hey, you should really write on the book, right? Underline, write in the margins. Okay, agree, disagree, write the words you don't understand. Okay, for some people it's anathema. Okay, it's akin to a death sentence. Fine, come up with a system, right? Put sticky notes. Write them on a Word document or OneNote or Google Docs or whatever. Yeah, have a separate notebook. Okay, whatever you do, okay, is not really the point. Okay, if it works for you and you're extracting what you should be extracting from the book, you're on the right track. Okay, so asking these questions must become a habit. As I've said, that means you need to put a system in place, and you must also know how to answer them, right? Precisely and accurately. Many people ignore good books, not because they're lazy, so much as they don't know how to make them their own, so to speak. Okay? So what does that mean anyway? Okay? This essentially means, according to Adler, okay, remember, 1972, there are no laptops and stuff, okay? I've given you the alternatives. But for him and Van Doren, it means writing in it. Okay, write in the margins, write in spaces, anywhere. Okay, thinking is writing and writing is thinking, right? They feed each other via a positive loop. Okay, you cannot, if you just think something, it remains muddled, right? When you're forced to write it, you're forced to organize your thoughts. Okay, and when you organize your thoughts, you have more to write about. The more you write about, the more you can think. Okay, and so on. It's a beautiful, positive, self-feeding loop. Okay, I've written here, writing forces you to organize your thought, i.e. think, and the more you think, the more you'll have to say, i.e. write about. Okay, therefore, when you write in the margins, often called annotation, okay, differences or agreements, you write quick summaries, reactions, make links to other ideas or texts, questions, okay, whatever, all right, whatever it is. So annotating may involve all or some of the following, okay. These are their suggestions. I don't think I've added any of my own, but anyway, okay, the first is to underline. I've showed you I've underlined. Okay, using vertical lines to mark long passages or to further emphasize a chunk of text. Okay, that's not something I use, but it's in the book. I thought I'd tell you about it. For extremely important arguments, use a star or an asterisk or whatever, any symbol that works for you. Okay, I also don't use that. Maybe I should. Use numbers for an extended argument to help you keep track of the points stated. Okay, so the author will start with an argument, and oftentimes, especially in things like philosophy, those arguments can run for pages and pages and pages. Okay, so to help you stay organized and to help you find what you want more quickly, try numbering them. Okay, so point 1 starts on whatever, page 5, right? Where does it end and where does point 2 begin? Okay, it may be 3 pages from point 1. Okay, So I think especially for philosophy, but I'm sure other works as well, this is a really good point to keep in mind. Okay. 5. If the author mentions a point on several separate pages, write the page numbers accordingly for easy comparison or referencing. All right. You can do this, in several ways. Okay. You can write all of them. Okay. So if the author talks about this on page 5, 8, 13, and 16, okay, on page 5, you can write all the other pages, right? 8, whatever I said, 12, 14, 16. Okay. And then on page 8, you write 5, 12, 14, 16, and so on. Okay. 6, we can try circling key terms. Finally, write anywhere you have space questions or answers related to the passage or passages. Okay. I've given you examples of what you can write. Okay. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Write more questions. Okay. As I said here, does it remind you of another author? If so, what work? Do you remember the work? Okay. Write those down. You never know when they might be, when they might prove useful. So all of these will allow you to make a personalized outline of the book, okay, which serves several purposes. The most important of these is demonstrating to yourself that you have grasped the overall structure of the book, right? That you must get to a point where you can mentally visualize, okay, where the author started, where he or she, moved to, and how he or she ended. Right? It's important to have that structure in mind. Another reason is having a quick reference, right? When you need one. So if you do write a detailed outline, and then you're like, yeah, right? He talks about, for instance, speed reading. I know it's somewhere at the beginning, but I forgot. Is it chapter 1? Is it chapter 2? Is it chapter 3? Oh man, is it even in part 1? Could be in part 2, right? If you have it all planned out, you know where to go quickly. Okay. So what may seem like a waste of time at the beginning will pay you dividends in the long run. Again, okay, I've said that in the overview, I think. These rules are written to perfection. Okay. This is how a 10 out of 10 looks like. Will all books deserve your full effort? Will all books deserve that 10 out of 10? No. Right? Some books you read and you're like, oh God, I'm not touching that ever again, right? It's not for me. Maybe you tried a new genre. I tried reading finance books. My God. I mean, you can imagine someone who comes from an English lit background and, I have a master's in classics and ancient history. So, my brain is a very humanities brain, right? I don't like reading things like business and stuff. But I said, learn how to invest. It'll be good for you, right? Think about your future. So I got a book. You'll see it on my Goodreads. Investing for Dummies, right? I mean, it's the easiest book probably to read, and it was hell, right? It was absolute hell. Okay, it's so boring, and not because the author is a bad author. On the contrary, okay, but it was so bland, right? It was so boring. The content is boring, right? The genre is boring to me, right? How to make money. I'd rather be learning about myself and the world and, all that jazz, right? So, sorry, I'm not summarizing that one. I'm not reading it again, right? I decided to, give a professional my money, even if they're going to take 2% of it or something, and let someone who knows what they're doing invest for me. Okay, so did I outline the book? No. Did I summarize it? No. Okay. Okay. That does not mean that, I didn't read well. I read to fit my purpose. Okay. But if I had planned on coming back to it, having an outline is important. Okay. Anyway, these are the major ideas of this chapter. Okay, with its closing comes the end of part 1. I'll see you in the next video where we start part 2. Okay, hi, welcome back. How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. This is the first chapter of part 2, and part 2 is called The Third Level of Reading, Analytical Reading. Okay, this has a whole part devoted to it. As I said, it's the lengthiest part of the book that deals with a single topic. Okay, we're on chapter 6 called Pigeonholing a Book. Okay, so the main point of this chapter is the following. Okay, just as you would not enter a class without knowing what to expect of the course and the teacher. Okay, I know it sounds stupid, but no one would do that, right? But what they would do is start reading a book without knowing what the heck it is. Okay, so just like you would not enter a classroom, okay, randomly, so too should you not approach a book without knowing what it entails, right? The conventions that govern its type or its genre, and so on. Okay, you need to go in, right, knowing what to expect, just as you would to a class. Okay, so one of the very first tasks you should do as a reader is to classify a text. Okay, ideally before you start reading. Bear in mind, though, that this is not always as straightforward as it seems. Okay, because there's plenty of overlap between genres. Okay, especially these days, and he said this, or Adler said this, 50 years ago. Okay, exactly 50 years ago, 1972. We're in 2022. Okay, so yeah, so you can imagine how even more convoluted things are now. So even if you've identified a work as, say, expository, all right, which is still relatively easy to do, you must then break it down further, okay? Because different subjects require different approaches, all right? All right, so the easiest way to identify a book's type is to pre-read, all right? Look at the title, table of contents, author, summary, preface, index. We've talked about them, okay, in the last chapter or the one before, okay? Especially in expository works, the author's main contention is often stated explicitly, okay? There's no need to hide what the author is trying to do in an expository work, okay? So knowing what a book is about allows us to constrain our expectations, right? It allows us to ask reasonable questions, okay? Questions that are related to the genre. Be aware, however, that there's no clear-cut, universally agreed upon method to classify books, right? Since, as I stated earlier, there's some degree of overlap, okay? I remember reading a book once, In Search of Stones, by, what's his name? The guy who wrote The Road Less Traveled, Scott M. Peck, okay? He wrote a book that his editors had. It was a nightmare for his editors. Okay, if you've read it, you'll know, right? It's a spiritual book that's also an autobiography. That's also like you could have classified it as either one of those, right? He's talking about his own life, but it's also spiritual and okay, many things. Okay, it's also a bit of history, right? I think he was talking about the history of Britain, how these monoliths, right, these large stones, got to be where they are. Should you put that under tour guide books? Okay, so it was all over the place. Okay, not every book is that muddled in terms of where it belongs, but it's also something to keep in mind. Okay, despite all this, most books fall into one of two broad categories. Okay, practical and theoretical. Okay, for our purposes here, practical is defined as something that instigates immediate or readily applicable action. Okay, you read it, you know what to do, right? You know what to change. While theoretical deals with knowledge, okay, i.e. that which can be understood. Okay, so there are some things you understand, some books that change the way you think about something. Other books ask you to take action. Okay, so yeah, so this further distinction, however, does not eliminate the challenge of classifying text, right? Because the terms practical and theoretical themselves overlap. Okay, so that adds to the complication. For instance, one cannot or should not act without sufficient knowledge. Okay, again, the world is more complex than we like to think. Okay, so yeah, the world is not divided neatly into, now I think, now I act, now I think, now I act. Sometimes and oftentimes they happen simultaneously. Okay, it would behoove you, though, to keep an open mind and try to see how a particular author approaches his or her particular text. You can do so more effectively if you have some knowledge about the different type of text beforehand. Okay, that should go without saying. All right, that ends this chapter. Hello and welcome back to All About Book Summaries. We are doing how to read a book. We are on part 2, chapter 7 now, X-raying a book. All right, as discussed in the last chapter, the first rule of analytical reading involves pigeonholing a book, right, or classifying it accurately. The second rule is this: make sure you can say what the entire book is about in a single sentence or at most a few sentences, okay? Remember that as a writer, you outline first and then pen your drafts, okay? As a reader, you apply a reverse order, i.e. you find out how the book is structured, okay? And this brings us to the third rule. Identify the major parts of the text and recognize how they relate to one another. I quote, "A good book, like a good house, is an orderly arrangement of parts." Page 77. So writing, like many human endeavors, is complex, and a well thought out, well organized book will have independent yet related parts. The author, especially one writing an expository work, will often help you wrap your head around his or her text, most often in the preface. Do not neglect to read such introductory passages, but also remain vigilant, because ultimately it is up to you as a reader to determine the soundness of an author's organization. Ironically, I remember someone on Goodreads criticizing the way this book is organized. Anyway. Summarizing a book using a few terse sentences has become increasingly challenging for most people, okay? For reasons that I won't go into here, okay? I will say that in order to improve both your reading and speaking abilities, try to avoid superfluity, okay? Okay, don't be superfluous. All right, in addition, keep in mind that a correct summary or outline of a book can take on several forms, okay? But this does not mean that any summary is good. Okay, that's important to keep in mind, or that all summaries are equal. Okay, consider checking out the actual book, How to Read a Book, if you want to see examples of outlines of familiar works. Okay, he goes into, I think, Darwin's On the Origin of Species and a couple of others. Okay. Also keep in mind that perfection is not the aim when outlining. Okay, because no book is perfect. Okay, and neither is any reader. So to keep you grounded, though, you should aim to outline just enough, right? Good enough. So what constitutes good enough differs from person to person, but you will discover what works for you in terms of form and length by putting all this into practice, okay? In other words, your first summary isn't going to be great. Your second one's going to be a bit better, okay? And you'll improve as you move along, okay? So if it's the first time if it's your first time doing this, it's going to take some trial and error before you get to a place where you're comfortable. Okay, there's one more rule that needs to be stated. Discover and explicitly state what the author's challenges were. The book, any book, is usually an attempt to answer a problem or set of problems, right? You can more easily follow an author's line of thinking if you know what these are, okay? What was he or she trying to tackle? So there are a myriad questions you can ask yourself in order to arrive at a satisfactory answer. Okay, so to summarize, the rules discussed thus far are these, and I quote directly from the book from page 95. 1. Classify the book according to kind and subject matter. 2. State what the whole book is about with the utmost brevity. 3. Enumerate its major parts in their order and relation, and outline these parts as you have outlined the whole. 4. Define the problem or problems the author is trying to solve. All right, that's it for this chapter. Hello and welcome back. We are summarizing how to read a book, and this is part 2, chapter 8, coming to terms with an author. In this chapter, we will discuss the importance of coming to terms with an author, and the reason for this is simple. Okay, if an author uses a word in a certain definition or connotation, and if your understanding of it differs, communication will be adversely affected. Duh, right? Um, Makes sense, but worth mentioning nonetheless. Okay, therefore, it's the writer's job to avoid ambiguity when writing. Okay, with some exceptions like poetry, we'll look at those in due time. Okay, but unless you're writing poetry or unless it's a song, perhaps. Okay, your job is to be as clear as possible as a writer. Okay, and the reader's job to understand the precise meaning is to understand the precise meaning of the major terms being used. Okay, hence rule 5. Okay, identify the most important words an author employs and use them as a catalyst for comprehending his or her major terms. Okay, keep in mind that the use of language is a paradoxical phenomenon, right? And what I mean by this is that although it is designed as a medium of communication, it sometimes results in the very opposite outcome. Okay, words are an imperfect attempt at expressing thoughts and ideas. Yet, apart from perhaps art, they are our only means of doing so. Okay, so since language is far from ideal, it is inevitable that effort must be put into understanding how a particular author uses specific words. In short, reading and writing involve giving and taking. Okay, a reader cannot expect any author to get through to him or her if they don't make the effort to overcome the obstacles that language invariably entails. Okay, so it's always important to remember we're dealing with an imperfect medium. Okay, useful though it may be. Okay, language is imperfect. So this brings us to the next question. How do we find these special words, these terms, right? The first caveat is that not all words are important. Okay, most in fact are not. The first step is to focus on the words that give you trouble for any reason. Okay, they may be difficult, they may be unfamiliar, or the choice of their use in a specific context may not be immediately apparent. Okay, so what is this word? Why is it being used here? Okay, if you pause and ask about those, you've probably stumbled upon your terms. Okay, moreover, you may know a word's denotation. Okay, you may know the word's dictionary definition, but you may not be familiar with its connotations, okay, or how it relates to other words. So if you understand the passage these terms are in, you'll understand which words are important to the writer. Another paradox, isn't it? Okay, so to understand the words, you must understand the passage, and to understand the passage, you must understand the important words. Okay, here I would like to remind my viewers about something I mentioned in my earlier videos. Okay, you cannot possibly comprehend what an author has to say without at least reading the book, okay, a passage, an article, whatever, at least twice. Okay, so when you read it at least twice, the second time round, after you've gotten the full picture, okay, then you'll be in a better position to say what is important and what isn't. Okay, so we go back to this. So far we have two pieces of advice that are indispensable. Okay, one, read the thing more than once. Okay, and two, ask questions. If you want to become a better reader, ask questions. Okay, so far I've mentioned a process of elimination, okay, in order to pinpoint terms. There are other ways, okay, starting with the author's repetition or stress of certain terms. Okay, an author may define specific words, italicize them, or place them in quotation marks, and so on. Okay, so the authors often help you, okay, know these terms. Also, it helps to be aware that every profession has its own nomenclature, okay, words that are common to all practitioners of these professions. They may use them conventionally or have their own unique definitions, okay? And it's important to be aware of this in either case. In some fields, this is easier done than others, okay? Philosophy, for instance, is one subject matter where common words with agreed upon meanings are difficult to find. Okay, and the authors go into an extended discussion on this. Remember, Mortimer J. Adler, the original writer of the first book, the 1940 edition, is a philosopher. Okay, so when he talks about philosophy, it's important to For me, at least, it's important to listen. Okay. Another technique is to look for words related to or dependent upon the initial key terms you identified. Okay. Let me read that again. Another technique is to look for words related to or dependent upon the initial key terms you identified. Okay. So if you've identified whatever 6 key terms, okay, what are the words that sort of go under them? All right. That's important. In this chapter and this video specifically, okay, terms is obviously an important, term. But so is ambiguity, right? Paradox of language, and so on. Still another tool in finding important terms is identifying where and when an author argues with another over a word's meaning or usage. Okay, this is a clear sign that a specific word or idea is important to the author. Okay, so if he tells you, whatever, author A said that, author B said that, but I think this, okay, you know you've probably stumbled upon a goldmine of terms. Okay, last point. Once you've identified the terms of an author, your work is not done. Okay, sometimes a certain term stays the same throughout the text. However, in other instances, the word's connotations shift. Okay, so how can you be aware of this? The short answer is context clues. Okay, look at the context. Look at the words before and after the term. Okay, from the words you do understand, you should be able to identify the meaning or at least the connotations of the term you are exploring. Okay, tapping into what you know in order to understand what you don't is no simple task, but it's not an impossible one. Okay, you should also be aware that there is no one true, tried and tested method for achieving the task of understanding a term and making sense of it. Okay, it's like making a jigsaw puzzle. Okay, some trial and error is involved, but the more you make, the easier it becomes. The easier it becomes for you to find your way through it, and the more confident you'll become. So, in addition, note that some terms can stand for several different meanings, while one meaning can have several words attached to it. Okay, such as nonetheless and nevertheless. All right. A word of caution then. Do not assume that when an author uses the same word, it has the same meaning. Okay, and likewise, do not assume that a term has changed only because a synonym has been employed. Okay, note also that phrases, not just words, can be terms. Okay, although phrases are often less ambiguous in general. Okay, that's the end of this chapter. Well, hello again. Welcome back. We're doing How to Read a Book, part 2. This is chapter 9, Determining an Author's Message. So, when analyzing a book, it might prove useful to think of the endeavor as a business deal, but in reverse. So in a business deal, you find out what the offer is, and then you come to terms, if you're interested. When reading a book in depth, you must come to terms with an author first, and then figure out what the proposition is and whether you agree with it or not. So, good authors not only have arguments, right, i.e. reasons to back up their claims or opinions, but these are usually arranged in the following manner, right? Here's what I think, here's why I think it, and here's why it matters, right? Or here's how you can apply it, or here's why you should care. Good writers generally build their arguments gradually, introducing words or terms first, then forming phrases and sentences that help their arguments along, and finally crafting a string of sentences, culminating in paragraphs. If you have created one, your outline of the book, okay, can help you identify key propositions and arguments. So, an outline allows you to pinpoint the major parts of a book. Once this is done, you can then look for the important words in those parts, working your way up from these terms in order to decipher the author's main contention. Before we move on, recall from the last chapter that some words can have several meanings and that one meaning can be expressed by more than one word. Okay, so to determine an author's message, which is the title and aim of this chapter, you must carry this knowledge to the sentence level. Okay, so just because a sentence is grammatically simple, okay, so in other words, it's not compound, it's not complex, it's not compound complex, does not necessarily mean that it only expresses one idea. right, as most people are taught. Okay, I mean, even I, do I teach it this way? Anyway, okay, that's a story for another time. Okay, needless to say, I mean, the other types of sentences almost always have more than one idea, right? Um, but to agree or disagree with an author, you as a reader must first be generous, right? What do I mean by generous? Generous in the sense that you must put forth an honest effort to understand what the author is saying, right? To this end, you will inevitably need grammar, boring and tedious as it might sometimes be. Okay, we come to them finally. Okay, we've done 5 rules so far, so here are rules 6 and 7. Rule 6, highlight the most important sentences and find out what propositions they contain. And rule 7, construct the main arguments of a text via the connections between these important sentences. The next logical question and the next step is to ask how, right? How does one find and interpret these key sentences? Okay, the answer is similar to the one given before about finding key terms, right? If some sentences are difficult to understand, or if the author has repeated them or the ideas that they contain frequently, right? These, among others, are signs one must be on the lookout for. The key terms you have singled out will aid you here because they are often contained in sentences where the main argument hinges. Okay? The opposite is also true, by the way. If you identify important sentences, you will surely find critical terms in them. Okay? Finally, learn to recognize arguments, which are usually a sequence of paragraphs offering evidence or conclusions. Undoubtedly, important sentences will be found there. Okay? In the case of this book, at the end of many of these chapters, as I said also at the beginning, the authors, they tend to summarize, right? And this is especially true for the rules that they give. Okay, so obviously this is important to them. Okay, and likewise, these summaries are important, right? They act to A, refresh your memory in case you've forgotten about any of them, and B, they're said in different and more straightforward terms. Okay, making sure that you understand them. So I've mentioned several times in my summary of this book that you cannot understand a book properly by reading it only once. Okay, we come back to this. And here's another reason why this is so. When one reads a text for the first time, even an expository one, okay, there's a curiosity that must be satiated before one can begin to analyze. Okay, so not only do you not have a grasp of the entire book and its structure, okay, you're reading because you're curious. You're right. You're curious as to what's going to happen next. Okay, and this curiosity gets in the way of analyzing. Okay, so assuming the book interests you, the novelty will more often than not completely wear off. Okay, only after you finish the book. It is when this novelty wears off that you're ready to ask the questions necessary to analyze and understand. Before that, your curiosity is usually in the way. Okay, great. Back to the author's propositions. One of the simplest and most effective ways of measuring your understanding of the propositions of a text is to restate them using your own words. Okay, we've touched upon this before. Many people say they understand. If you ask them, have you understood? Okay, as a teacher, we've all been there. Okay. You ask your students, hey, have you understood? And they say, yeah. And say, okay, can you explain it to me? Oh, no, I can't. Right? And the reason they can't is not necessarily because they're shy, right? It's because it's hard, right? It's hard to explain something simply and without using too many words, superfluity, right? Or being redundant, repeating yourself needlessly. It's tough. It's hard. So, yeah. So a clear sign that you haven't really understood is an over-reliance on the author's word, right? If you need to use the author's word as a crutch, then you've probably not understood what's going on. Okay? Words will have been exchanged between the two of you, but not the meaning behind them. Okay? Another test is to ask yourself, how relevant is this argument to my life? Okay, where have I seen it being applied? Or how can I see it being applied? Okay, what you read must be applicable to daily life somehow. Okay, be it in the realm of thinking or in the realm of action or behavior. Okay, if you cannot see the connection, it probably means that your analysis needs elaboration, right? You need to dig deeper. You need to think more. Okay, assuming, of course, you're reading a good book, right? That an author is carefully put together. Okay, moving on. What about the author's arguments? One major challenge here is that there is no strict definition of a paragraph, right? If there were, you could go by length, right? Everything above 8 lines in a paragraph, means it's an argument, or gearing up to an argument or something. Unfortunately, some people argue one sentence could be a paragraph. Okay, so paragraphs vary in length and they vary in content. So what we're concerned with here is essentially the number of arguments. Some paragraphs contain more than one, while the same argument may run through several paragraphs. So this is something to be aware of. All right. Being aware of this is the first step to recognizing arguments. Okay, so I say it again. One paragraph may have more than one argument, and one argument may run, through several paragraphs. Authors that emphasize clarity will aid you by intermittently summarizing their key points. Okay, you can help them, and you can help yourself by pausing at these key moments and ensuring you have truly understood what has been summarized before going on. Okay, if an argument is sound, anyone should be able to state it simply and using only a few words. Okay, do you need to be an expert logician in order to do all of this? No. Okay, here are a few steps to keep in mind. First, if you discover a conclusion, there will probably be reasons that precede it. Okay, if you see reasons, they must lead somewhere. Okay. Second, see whether you'll need inductive or deductive reasoning. Okay. The former, so inductive reasoning, goes from specific to general, while the latter assumes a general premise and proceeds to give specific evidence. Okay. There's one is not superior or inferior to the other. Okay. It depends on many things. Okay. It depends on the topic at hand, the genre in general, and it depends on the style of an author. Okay. The third and final step asks you, the reader, to be aware of the author's assumptions. Okay. All authors, honest or otherwise, need some form of assumptions in order to prove their points. Okay. Nothing can be established if everything needs to be proven. Okay. So there are some things that an author takes for granted. Okay. So just because he asks you to take it for granted, what I mean to say is, if an author asks you to take something for granted, okay, give him or her the benefit of the doubt and take it for granted and see where the argument goes. Okay. After that, assess. Okay. After that, give your judgment. After that, give your opinion. Okay. It's, how do I put it? It's intellectual etiquette. Okay. To do so. All right. It is time to bring this chapter to a close. Okay. Recall that the first stage of analytical reading involved rules 1 to 4, which were related to the outline. These new rules, to which we will add one more, deal with the interpretation of the book's contents. The last rule is this: find out what the author's solutions are. Okay. So you've identified his or her main arguments. How successful was he or she in solving them? Okay. To recap, here are rules 5 to 8, taken from page 136. Come to terms with the author by interpreting his keywords. One of the criticisms of Adler, right? Product of his time. So know his or her or they or anything. Okay, just his keywords. So come to terms with the author by interpreting his keywords. 6, grasp the author's leading propositions by dealing with his most important sentences. 7, know the author's arguments by finding them in or constructing them out of sequences of sentences. 8, determine which of his problems the author has solved and which he has not. And as to the latter, decide which the author knew he had failed to solve. Thanks. I'll see you in the next chapter. Okay, hi. Welcome back. So this is my channel, all about book summaries and a bit of opinion. I mean, I can't help myself, especially with things that I've dealt with. It's too tempting. I have to give my opinion. But for the most part, this is a channel where I summarize books in depth. The book I'm doing now is How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. We're on part 2, chapter 10, and the title of this one is Criticizing a Book Fairly. So, as you can probably tell from the chapter title, there's a certain intellectual etiquette, right, when it comes to forming an opinion about a book. It is important when doing so not to descend into bickering, okay? What I mean by bickering here is arguing just for arguing's sake, okay? I have nothing to say, I don't know what I'm talking about, but hey, I'm going to talk anyway, right? Either out of malice or out of a sense of insecurity, or because you're just someone who feeds off negative energy. Okay, resist the temptation if that's the case. Okay, the point of the point of reading and analyzing and assessing and being an intellectual is to engage in profitable conversation. Okay, the worst thing a reader can do after reading a good book is to put it aside or fail to criticize it. Okay, so you shouldn't run away from this. Okay, you should definitely give your opinion. Okay, you should definitely criticize it. Okay, but do so generously. Okay, make sure you've understood first. It's your obligation. Okay, as a reader, you must, after reading a book, a good book, either to agree with it, or to disagree with it, or to defer judgment. Okay? And a reader can only do so after reading actively, which was basically what we've been talking about, okay, throughout, and will continue to talk about. Okay? Again, this is something you must do. Okay? Agree, disagree, or defer judgment. All right. Many students, okay, and people in general, they assume that since they're not intellectually on par with the author, they have no right to pass judgment or criticism, okay? This is far from the truth, okay? Not so. Authors generally write for the everyday man and woman. And so, after reading a certain book, you should have understood the main points the author had to make. Consequently, you should have reached a stage where you can agree or refute, or realize that you need to read other texts in order to pass fair judgment. Okay? A good student is active. A good reader is active, not passive. I quote here, "To regard anyone except yourself as responsible for your judgment is to be a slave, not a free man." Page 141. Okay, so I think that gets the point across. Gets the point across. Okay? Again, there's an assumption to what I and Adler and the quote I've just said, right? You can only do this if the author has written for the layperson, okay, the general audience, the everyday man or woman, okay. Well, I think we'll mention that at some point, okay. Some books are simply not written for the general public, okay. Most, however, are. All right, we're now ready to divulge Rule 9. I quote, "Do not begin to talk back until you have listened carefully and are sure you understand." Page 142. Okay, I've already mentioned the 3 stances you can take. Agree, disagree, or suspend judgment. Great. By the way, you can be wrong in agreeing, all right? Just as you can be in disagreeing. That's something to keep in mind. The last stance, suspending judgment, indicates that the evidence has been insufficient for you to make up your mind or be otherwise persuaded. Okay? I've already touched upon rule number 10, but here it is, stated explicitly. When you disagree, do so reasonably, okay? And not disputatiously or contentiously. Okay, page 145. Learning the truth is what matters, not winning the argument. Okay, if you have trouble agreeing, if you feel incompetent and feeble for doing so, then your problem is not an intellectual one, it's a psychological one. Okay, if you feel that agreement is weakness, that's your problem, not the author's. Okay, there's no nice way to say that. All right. And not only should you not callously disagree, but you must also recognize that disagreements can be resolved. Okay? In other words, do not be insensitive when disagreeing, but do not be hopeless either. Usually, some form of compromise can be reached. And in the worst case scenario, agree to disagree. It's that simple. Okay? A learned person, I quote, should be as much prepared to have his own mind changed as seek to change the mind of another. Page 148. Again, the main obstacle here is not intellect, okay? But, rather it's a psychological obstacle, okay? In this case, the ego that interferes with genuine communication. Last point, this chapter. To agree or disagree, the reader must differentiate between knowledge and opinion. In the last video, I talked about reasons and propositions. If an author's claim is not backed up by these, such as evidence and facts, chances are that his or her claim is, in fact, an opinion, not an argument. Arguably, the point of reading a book is not to judge the author, the person, but the book, the content. So, here is rule number 11. I quote, respect the difference between knowledge and mere personal opinion by giving reasons for any critical judgment you make. Page 150. Of course, just because knowledge, as opposed to opinion, is supported by convincing evidence, should not goad us into accepting it blindly. New evidence may surface that contradicts or refutes it. Still, the distinction between knowledge and opinion stands. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one. Hi again. Welcome to the last chapter of part 2, chapter 11. We are doing how to read a book, and this chapter is titled Agreeing or Disagreeing with an Author. Before doing this, agreeing or disagreeing, you must first make sure you have understood the book. If you do, and if you agree, there isn't much left for you to do, except perhaps think about how to apply what you have read, or to compare and contrast an argument or claim to that made in another text. Apart from agreeing, you can of course disagree or defer your evaluation. To do any of these, to come to any sort of conclusion, you must meet the author halfway. In other words, not only must terms be exchanged between the two of you, but knowledge as well. Ideally, your minds must become one in terms of understanding. Okay? Understanding does not necessarily mean agreement. Okay? That's an important distinction to make. You can understand what drove someone, say, to suicide or to crime. Okay? But that does not mean that you agree that these were the only solutions available in their predicaments. Okay? So not all disagreement stems from misunderstanding. All right? But to refute or agree with a certain claim, you must understand it as well as, if not better than, the author you are contending with. When disagreeing, make sure you're being rational and not merely expressing strong emotions or prejudices. Okay? There are exceptions, of course, okay, such as speeches and poetry. Second, become aware of your own prejudices. This is important because it allows you to be generous toward the assumptions of other people, which they will inevitably have, and make you better able to understand their arguments. To prove a point, an author may ask you to take something for granted. I've mentioned that, I forgot if it was the last video or the one before that. Okay, so just because an opposing thing may be taken for granted just as easily, or just because your assumptions lie elsewhere, these are not, this is not justifiable ground for dismissing an author's arguments. Okay? In fact, it constitutes poor intellectual etiquette. The final point is this. Try to be as objective and unbiased as you possibly can. All right? Is this an ideal? Yeah. Okay? And it will probably forever remain so. But that is no excuse for not aiming toward it. Okay? When you civilly disagree, there are usually 4 things you can say about the book and the author. Okay? So, number 1, you're telling the author, and I've taken these all from page 156, you are uninformed. You are misinformed. You are illogical. Your reasoning is not cogent. And 4, your analysis is incomplete. Okay? These 4, end quote. These 4 remarks are not mutually exclusive. Okay? An author may have committed one or more of them. All right? In any case, be prepared to give reasons, not feelings, as to why you have passed certain judgment. Let's look at each of the 4 situations in detail. When someone is uninformed, it means that they are missing a vital and relevant piece of information. Without it, an argument will be flawed or incomplete. When someone claims to have knowledge they do not possess, that person is labeled as misinformed. Okay? Here, an author usually has a skewed or inaccurate version of the facts. And so any conclusions drawn from them are implausible. Okay? When an author reasons poorly from good grounds, he or she is said to be illogical. Okay? This is also true of authors who argue inconsistently. Okay? To recap, an author who argues well but whose evidence is tainted is misinformed. An author who argues poorly but has sound evidence is illogical. And one who's unaware of essential information is uninformed. Okay? If an author has not committed any of these 3, as far as you are concerned, you must agree with him or her. Okay? You may not like the conclusions they have drawn. Okay? They may go against your religious beliefs, your upbringing, okay? Your insecurities, your prejudices, okay? But if the evidence has been deemed sound, you have no choice but to agree. All right. Interesting. We haven't talked about the 4th and final point, that of incomplete analysis. Okay? This is not strictly reserved for disagreement, okay? But deferred judgment. So people have limited time and limited knowledge. And no text can ever be exhaustive. Okay? Just like no human is perfect, no book is perfect. Okay? The final point then is not just possible, right? The 4th point, okay? That of incomplete analysis. It's not just possible, but inevitable, right? So you can always say, okay, yeah, you mentioned this, but did you read that? You could have mentioned that. Okay? So your job as a reader is to ask yourself, what is missing? What problems have not been fully or adequately solved? And use the text as a springboard in order to explore an idea further. Okay? This is a major reason why you as a reader should define terms precisely. Okay? They allow you to compare different works more easily. Okay, I'll now summarize what's been discussed so far concerning analytical reading. Okay? Remember, it is done. Part 2 is over. All right? Or about to be. I have taken these from pages 163 and 164 of the book. Okay. Oof, all the rules, 15 rules. Are you ready? All right, let's start. Number 1, classify the book according to kind and subject matter. 2, state what the whole book is about with the utmost brevity. 3, enumerate its major parts in their order and relation and outline these parts as you have outlined the whole. 4, define the problem or problems the author has tried to solve. 5, come to terms with the author by interpreting his key words. 6, grasp the author's leading propositions by dealing with his most important sentences. 7, know the author's arguments by finding them in or constructing them out of sequences of sentences. 8. Determine which of his problems the author has solved and which he has not, and of the latter, decide which the author knew he had failed to solve. 9. Do not begin criticism until you have completed your outline and your interpretation of the book. Do not say you agree, disagree, or suspend judgment until you can say, I understand. 10. Do not disagree disputatiously or contentiously. 11. Demonstrate that you recognize the difference between knowledge and mere personal opinion by presenting good reasons for any critical judgment you make. 12. Show wherein the author is uninformed. 13. Show wherein the author is misinformed. 14. Show wherein the author is illogical. And 15. Show wherein the author's analysis or account is incomplete. With this, we're ready to move on to the last chapter of part 2. Huh? Why do I have this? I thought this was the last chapter. Why have I written this? No. Oh, okay, I'm right. I was right when I wrote it. I was wrong when I said it. Okay, we still have one more chapter. Chapter 12. Okay, I apologize. Chapter 12. I'll see you soon. Hi. So this is it. This is the final chapter of part 2 of how to read a book. Okay, chapter 12, aids to reading. All right. So relying on your mind, your thoughts, and your knowledge is the best way to go about reading a book. And I've talked about that in, it was one of the earlier videos. Okay. Still, it is sometimes necessary to consult other texts, okay, such as dictionaries and commentaries. The trick, however, is not to over-rely on them, okay? This chapter deals with 4 external aids, namely relevant experiences, other books, commentaries and abstracts, and reference books. There is no golden rule as to what to use, when to use it, and where, okay? You will have to make that judgment, but please do that only after you've exhausted your own mental faculties. All right. Starting with relevant experience, it's important to mention that there are 2 types, common and special. Common is the type available to all people, given that they've been exposed to it simply by being alive. Okay? Special experience is not found in everyday life, but requires whatever. Okay, a laboratory, special tools, and the like. These 2 types are applicable to different works, but sometimes share certain genres. For example, you'll need common experience to read novels, special experience to test and understand certain scientific dissertations, and both types of experience for history and psychology. To test your understanding and your use of relevant experience, try to give a pertinent example based on your own experiences in relation to the text you have read. When it comes to reading other books as external aids, the most important thing to keep in mind is respecting chronology. Okay, great writers often build on each other, and so for some texts, especially in history and philosophy, some works need to be read before others in order for the more recent ones to make sense. For commentaries and abstracts, use these as little as possible. Okay, there are two main reasons for this. The first one is that some commentators, professional as they may seem, are not always correct in their analysis or discussion. Second, a commentary may be accurate but limited in scope. This in turn limits your view on the matter and oftentimes prevents you from looking for other perspectives, right? Perspectives you may have discovered had you not been influenced by another's opinion. Okay, so to sum up, read commentaries and abstracts if you must, only after reading the original work yourself. Abstracts in particular can serve as summaries that refresh your memory later on. Okay, now this is one of the reasons I am doing this, right? Remember, one of my target audience is people who have read the books I've summarized. Okay, you read it a year ago. You're not ready to read it again. Okay, but still you want to refresh your memory. Okay, that's partly what this channel is based on. Okay, so in that sense, okay, abstracts and summaries can be quite useful. Okay, there is one exception though to the rule of reading them only after the original text. Sometimes you need to determine whether or not a book is relevant to your research, to your essay, to whatever it is you're working on. Okay, in this case, by all means, read abstracts. Okay, because they will save you a considerable amount of time. Okay, that's another reason again why you may be on this channel. Okay, you want to decide. Okay, especially this book. Okay, it's so polarizing. All right, I mean, some people swear by it, like me. Okay, some people hated it. Okay, some people found the tone condescending, the writing too formal. Okay, the subtle disrespect for women. Okay, all his pronouns are his, right? Him, he. It's almost as if women don't exist. Okay, again, remember, this was written 50 years ago. The original one was written in 1940, 82 years ago. Okay, so the way I see it is cut the guy some slack. He's a product of his time. Okay, but yeah, okay, this book has been polarizing. So one of the reasons why you might come here or, or any other place, okay, is to decide, is it worth my time or not? Okay, moving on. What about reference books such as dictionaries and encyclopedias? Okay, there are a few things to keep in mind here. First, have some idea about what you're looking for. Okay, if it's a word, look at the context. Are the word's connotations negative, neutral, or positive? That's one thing to ask. Okay, does it seem related to other words you know? Is there a prefix, a suffix that gives you a hint? If you pretend that the word were missing, what would you put in that makes sense? So try to wrestle with a word, right? Before you passively run to the dictionary. Second, know where to find what you're looking for. Okay, will Wikipedia be enough, for instance? Oftentimes it is, right? Certainly not in academic writing. But if it's just something you're mildly interested in, you just want to get a general sense of, Wikipedia is great. Okay? Or do you need to consult a more specialized work? Okay? Third, know a reference book's organizational structure and its limitations. Okay? The former, so how it's structured, will allow you to find what you're looking for more quickly, while the latter, its limitations, prevents you from looking for answers that don't exist. Reference books, and I use the term book loosely here, okay? Remember, he was writing before, the internet was a thing, okay? So I'm using books here to mean everything, okay? Cliff Notes, online dictionary, Wikipedia, whatever. Okay, they contain information generally agreed upon, okay? They have little use, in other words, they're not very useful when it comes to, say, moral or philosophical questions. And that brings us to the fourth and final point. Know what people agree on and what they don't in order to make your search more effective. Great. When it comes to using a dictionary, keep in mind that it is more than a tool for you to check your spelling or pronunciation. Use it to look up, I quote, technical words, archaic words, literary allusions, or even familiar words used in obsolete senses. Page 180. Look at historical examples, okay? www.dictionary.com is a great website for all this, okay? I swear by it. Highly recommend you use it, at least for American English. Okay, use it, okay? Or any other resource. Use it to see how native speakers use certain words, okay? So if you're really interested, you can trace the word, okay? See how, a 16th century writer used it versus a 19th century one versus a modern one, okay? And see where they use it, okay? They pair it with what? What nouns, for instance, do they pair this adjective you're looking up with? And finally, see the context in which they use it. Is it usually used negatively? Is it usually used positively? Is it always simply neutral? Okay, all of these you can glean from a good dictionary. In this day and age, whenever the word encyclopedia is mentioned, we tend to think of Wikipedia. Okay, Personally, okay, and this is coming from a teacher, I don't see a problem in consulting it, okay, as long as one is using it for its intended purpose. And that purpose is usually to give someone a general but often brief introduction to a topic, okay? Ideally using facts in the word's most neutral sense, okay? And should that prove inadequate, supply you with sources to further expand your knowledge of the topic at hand, okay? Facts, by the way, are bits of information that are or can be, and this is an important distinction, agreed upon definitively, okay? Gold as a metal is an example of a fact. We may not know a certain person's date of birth, okay? But if it were to be proven, we can all agree on it then, okay? In other words, facts are not relative. They're not subject to opinions. Reference works, therefore, do not or should not contain arguments. The problem that many students make these days is to rely on Wikipedia to prove their arguments, okay? And that's when you're not using it for its intended purpose. Okay, this concludes part 2 of the book. Now we're done. Now it's all over. Lengthy part 2 is done. I'll see you for part 3 in the next video. Okay, welcome back to my channel, all about book summaries. So we now start with part 3, called Approaches to Different Kinds of Reading Matter. The book I'm working on is How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. We start with chapter 13, How to Read Practical Books. And so begins part 3 of the book. The rules so far have been necessarily general, right? Applying especially to works of nonfiction. In the coming chapters, these rules will be revised and adapted to suit specific genres. Okay, this chapter, as the title insinuates, will deal with practical books, those that require you to take some form of action after reading and, of course, agreeing with them. All right. The first caveat regarding practical books is that on their own they cannot solve the problems they have brought forth. They merely help, but only through action can the reader ultimately decide if the solutions have truly been practical, i.e. applicable in every sense of the word. The final test of a practical book then does not dwell in a theoretical realm, but in the real world. I am reminded of a pearl of wisdom here by Alan Watts, and I paraphrase. A person who thinks of nothing but his or her own thoughts will end up with a distorted outlook on reality. The way I see it, we must not only think, but wherever possible, apply as well. Okay, an author, try as he or she will, cannot give you particular actions for your particular situations. You must take the general and convert it into something personal and practical. In addition, you must strive to read between the proverbial lines. Not everything can be stated explicitly. Okay? Some things must be inferred. Needless to say, this is important for at least 2 reasons. To decide whether or not you agree with the author's recommendations, and, assuming you do, determining where and how to apply them. Remember, you can agree with someone's logic, yet not reach the same conclusion. When reading practical works, and indeed arguably anything, you need to keep in mind that a writer usually wants you to be persuaded. And to do so, he or she needs to appeal to both your emotions and the more rational side of you. In essence, this is called propaganda, a term that has garnered negative connotations, especially after the mid-20th century, for reasons that should be obvious. But not all propaganda entails deception. In fact, most writers cannot do without it. It is only when an author's true intentions are masked or otherwise distorted that a reader has the right to claim that he or she has been maliciously misled. But otherwise, it does not serve your best interest to resist everything all the time. Okay? That would simply mean that there's no need to read practical books. It is a delicate balance, okay? Being vigilant yet open-minded at the same time. No easy task. Lastly, and this is especially true when reading practical books, the author's outlook on his or her subject and any significant events that make up his or her historical background are important. Okay, although many schools of thought have turned away from this, stating that only the words and ideas themselves are what matter, regardless of who wrote them. Anyway, I don't want to go into this. Okay, where I stand and why. Okay, I can only point this out here. Because a debate of this sort is beyond the scope of this summary. Okay. Now let us visit the 4 questions that we had talked about from the start. The first one, what is the book about, remains unchanged. Okay, given that expository works are structured, it is imperative to form some manner of outline while reading them. Okay, in a practical work, perhaps the most important aspect to focus on is what is or are the author's problem or problems. Okay, to know what to apply and how to apply it, you need to know what it applies to. The second question, the one dealing with terms, propositions, and arguments, also remains largely unchanged. Okay. The third question, is mostly the domain of theoretical works, where you compare the author's propositions to your own experiences. It is still important to ask this question about a practical book, but in this case, your focus is on the ends an author proposes, okay? And your task is to gauge whether his or her methods are the best ones to reach such ends. The last question is, what of it? Here, if you agree with a practical book, some action on your part is required. Otherwise, your reading efforts will have been in vain. In other words, if the answer to question 3 is yes, i.e. it is true, then your task is, how do I apply what to where, and when do I apply it? Okay? To do this, you must both agree with the author and accept his or her rationale. There are several reasons why readers of practical books may not change their actions, despite agreeing and accepting the propositions involved. Some of these are the following. They may be too lazy or tired to take action. They may think they have understood when in fact they haven't. Or they may believe that it's not their prerogative, right? That the call to action falls on someone else's shoulders. And that's the end of chapter 13. Hi again, and welcome back to my channel. The book I'm summarizing in depth is called How to Read a Book. And we're on part 3, chapter 14. And the title of this chapter is How to Read Imaginative Literature. I start with a quote. I love this quote. Beauty is harder to analyze than truth. Page 204. This quotation from the chapter succinctly summarizes what it's about. Okay, think about it. A poem in general is more difficult to comprehend than, say, a recipe, right? This added challenge is the main reason why we're mentioning works of fiction, such as plays and novels, more than halfway through the book. Rather than starting with what to do, I'll first start with what not to do. Before that, though, let's make sure to discern between practical and fictional texts. Okay, what exactly is imaginative literature? Whereas expository texts aim to explain or analyze an experience, fiction in general tries to portray an experience as it is. All right, its purpose, therefore, is usually not to teach, but to entertain. This does not mean that only our imagination and our emotions are involved, okay? It's simply a matter of emphasis, okay? Works of imaginative literature prioritize entertaining you over teaching you, okay? That does not mean they do not teach, okay? We use these aspects of ourselves to a greater extent when tackling a work of fiction, okay? The emotions and imagination, okay? In other words. Practical works help shape the world we live in and make sense of it. Works of fiction help us to temporarily take a break and get away from it all. Of course, this does not apply to all works of fiction. Furthermore, works of fiction can indeed teach us, as I just said, but they do so via experience, not argumentation. Another difference between the two is that of ambiguity. Expository works, generally speaking, strive for meaning that is clear and explicit. On the other hand, works of fiction not only use but often depend on ambiguity. What is implied is just as important, if not more so, than what is stated. Slide aside, this is one of the reasons why, for now at least, I won't be doing works of fiction on this channel. Okay, they're meant to be experienced, right? And to experience it, you have to read it. Okay, if I just summarize the plot for you, it's or anyone, right? Um, it's not the same. Okay, I mean for this one, it's not the same. If you read this book with all the extra examples and obviously you're gonna get more out of it. But if you really understood, I think what I'm trying to say here, you can, you can pretty much get what it's, what this book is trying to teach you. Okay, not so for fiction, and that's why, again, at least for now, maybe forever, I won't be doing them. Anyway, all of this brings us to our first don't. Okay, remember, I'm going to start with the what not to do and then talk about what to do. All right? So, the first don't. Given that the author of fiction is describing an experience, try to let that experience leave its mark upon you. In other words, do not be as critical as you would when reading expository works. Okay? The second don't is this. Do not look for terms. Do not look for propositions. Do not look for arguments in texts of fiction. These belong to expository works. The meaning of, say, a poem rests in its entirety, right? That is, its whole, not a certain term. The last don't concerns truth. Do not judge a story based on historical, geographical, etc. accuracy. Okay, it is meant to be plausible, but not necessarily true. Exceptions exist, of course, most notably if the author, him or herself, has claimed that their story is, for instance, rooted in a certain historical period. In any case, works of fiction are not meant to be tested, right? And they're not meant to be applied in real life. As mentioned previously, what they can teach us differs, both in nature and application, to politics, philosophy, psychology, etc. Great. I see this in movies, a lot these days. People are so, I don't know what the word is. Critical doesn't accurately describe it. People are so fixated on things that don't matter, right? I remember reading about Face Off. If you guys were like me, alive and kicking in the 90s, okay, when that movie came out in 1997. I've noticed that the more modern viewers have really picked it apart, right? It's impossible for someone to remove, his face and, put it on another's face. And what do they say? They're like, character A slept with the wife of character B when it was supposed to be character B. How did she not realize that, his manhood is different? Okay. Just enjoy the damn movie. It's a damn good movie, right? Enjoy it for what it is, right? A suspenseful action movie. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to rant there. Okay, great. So the don'ts are behind us. Let's move on to the do's. Just like expository works, do classify imaginative literature according to genre. Okay, a play is different from a novel. Okay, a modern play is different from a Shakespearean play. Okay, you must also understand the unity of a text. In expository works, that means discovering what the problem was, which in turn leads to the main argument. Okay. The unity of a story, however, generally rests in its plot. Like expository texts, you must be able to summarize the plot in a few lines. Otherwise, your understanding of it will be vague at best. You must also be able to identify the parts that make up the whole. What this means in the case of fiction is forming a time frame that makes sense. Okay? Not all events that chronologically come first in a story start on the first page. Okay. Also, knowing what constitutes the elements of a plot, climax, falling action, so on, knowing these is also important. Okay, so much for the unity of a book and the relationship between parts and whole. Next come the interpretive rules of reading non-expository works. Previously, we named these terms, propositions, and arguments. Instead of terms, here we have characters, feelings, dialogues, events, and so on. Becoming familiar with them is vital to fully understanding a novel. Terms in expository works coalesce into propositions. In fiction, these are instead the world the author has created, a place where all of his or her characters live and interact. Lastly, and in lieu of arguments, imaginative literature contains the continuity of a plot. This is different from identifying its main elements, as mentioned before. Here, you're not distinguishing so much as becoming acutely aware of the plot's intricacy, how it's woven, how it's put together. The third and last part here is the rules of critiquing. Just as one should not, in expository works, pass judgment before understanding, you cannot, with imaginative literature, say whether or not you like a certain book before appreciating its message. In addition, and I quote here, we must remember the obvious fact that we do not agree or disagree with fiction. We either like it or we don't. Page 213. Furthermore, and while it's fair to criticize the premises of an author of expository works, it is not fair to do so in fiction. Here's what I mean by this. You cannot criticize Shakespeare, say, for making Desdemona a Venetian, right? Rather than a Sardinian. Okay? The author of fictional works has every right to choose his or her own world. What we as active readers can criticize is what they choose to do with those characters, with those settings, with the backgrounds, with that world. We criticize truth in expository works, beauty in literature. Ultimately, if you go through all the steps mentioned so far actively, you should be able to answer not only if you like a book or not, but why you like it. What makes it for you a good or enjoyable work of literature? And that's the end. I'll see you in the next video. Hi there. Welcome back to my channel. All about book summaries. And the book we are delving into is called How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. We are on part 30, chapter 15, suggestions for reading stories, plays, and poems. So, in the last chapter, we spoke of imaginative literature in general, and we adapted 3 questions posed when reading expository works to make them more suitable to works of fiction. The 4th question that must be tackled differently is, what of it? Recall that in practical expository works, some form of action on your part is required, and in theoretical works, mental action suffices. When it comes to imaginative literature, no action, at least analytically, is usually required on the part of the reader. The key word here is usually. For numerous times in history, a work of fiction was more effective at describing events or portraying experiences than any scientific report or philosophical treatise. Still, works of fiction are classified as fine art, okay? And a call to action is not their primary raison d'etre, okay? Fine here comes from the Latin, right, for finished, okay? In other words, works of fiction and art are the end, right? Not a means toward one. Okay, great. Let's now talk about time. How long should it take us to read stories? Ideally, the shortest amount of time possible. Otherwise, the unity of the plot will be lost, okay? The longer a novel or story, the more quickly you should get it over with, okay? Because otherwise you forget, who's whom and who's doing what, right? Furthermore, it's expected that you would not understand everything about a novel from the beginning, okay? This is not a weakness on your part, nor a shortcoming of the text, okay? This will become clear as the story progresses, provided, of course, it's well written. All right? Fiction has been a part of human history since time immemorial, right? And it seems to be a need for people. There are many theories as to why this is. Humans have both conscious and unconscious needs. The former tends to be satisfied by expository works, but the latter, at least partially, can be satisfied with fictional texts. For one thing, they allow us to experience what a character goes through. And these experiences, be it inheriting a large sum of money, loving greatly and bravely, etc., can be cathartic, right? An Aristotelian term, which means in this context, the purging or cleansing of emotions. Real life can be unjust, but fictional characters often get what they deserve. We may not be able to exact revenge on our unreasonable boss, but we can see it happening in stories. The reasons for and the advantages of reading fiction cannot be given justice here. Okay, so let's move on and talk about epic poems. In Western culture, these are Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, Dante's Divine Comedy, and Milton's Paradise Lost. Not only challenging to write, these are also challenging to read, okay, because they tax the attention and imagination of any reader. Still, reading them carefully and analytically will yield enormous satisfaction. Okay, we move on to plays, where one major challenge needs to be kept in mind. Plays were not meant for you to read them. Plays were meant to be performed. So when one is merely reading them, imagination is key. Key to understanding, key to analyzing, and key to engaging in them. Okay? One method to kickstart your imagination is to pretend that you are the director. You've been given this play and you're asked to direct. How would you set this scene up, right? How would you tell that actor to say that particular line? Okay? Very useful. May sound childish, but it's very, very useful. One last tip. If a certain passage seems inaccessible, try reading it out loud. Try reading it with feeling, okay? Get immersed in the character. This might help clear up otherwise opaque sections. Finally, let's talk about poetry. What makes something poetry is actually open to debate, okay? And it's not, again, this is not the purpose of the book, okay? Classifying poetry. Its purpose is to teach us how to read them, okay? So here's a few things to keep in mind. First, you can read a poem for the rest of your life and always discover new meanings in it, okay? Since you as a person change. Second, always read a poem, obviously not an epic one, non-stop on the first round, regardless of your perception, regardless of your understanding, okay? Just keep reading. A poem depends on its entirety to convey its message. You will not find meaning in any isolated part. Third, read the poem on your second reading out loud. Fourth, be sensitive to keywords and literary devices such as alliteration, rhythm, rhyme, okay, and so on. Lastly, and although research into a poet's life and times is useful, do not over-rely on these things, okay? And know that you can understand and enjoy a poem without such background knowledge. All right, thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to my channel all about book summaries. We are doing how to read a book. This is part 3, chapter 16, how to read history. Great. History is both fictional and expository in nature. It is fictional because it is, generally speaking, written in a chronological order that encompasses some form of story, right, broadly speaking. In many languages, in fact, the words story and history are synonymous, like in, French, for instance. Yet it is also expository, okay, because it's rooted in real life. It's rooted in primary and secondary sources. And whether theoretical or practical, it can be analyzed. It is not merely an experience, as works of fiction often are. Before moving on, let us mention the word fact. By definition, a fact is something agreed upon or known to be true. That is not the same as something being true. Furthermore, history is notoriously difficult to write and analyze, since there are many factors at stake. Unreliability of memory, deceit on the part of the historian or his or her sources, bias, insufficient data or lack of sources, and others. It is important to keep these in mind when reading history. When reading history, a priority should be to take note of the school of history the writer comes from. Some historians, for instance, believe that arranging certain causes and effects for past actions is futile, right? Because human behavior is so complex and interlinked. Okay? Other historians have different views and backgrounds, each with its own advantages and limitations. Being aware of all this is imperative to a clearer understanding of whatever text you're examining. Ultimately, of course, no one can claim to really know what happened, or even why something is happening the way it is right now in our present time, right? And that is exactly why some historians believe that if we don't understand why we act, right? We, the people in possession of our bodies, act a certain way, right? We certainly don't know everything that's happening now, even though we can see it, examine it, and think about it. Trying to reconstruct a period where, everyone is dead and everything is changed, simply doesn't yield anything. Anyway, just like psychologists then who can be Freudian, engage in CBT therapy and so on, theories of history differ. Consequently, to gain a solid understanding of whatever event or period you're interested in, it is vital to read as many accounts as possible. Varied accounts, I may add. Okay, it is not that people are intentionally misleading. Okay, they are invariably biased though, right? And because of that, and especially when it comes to history, a reader must be extra vigilant. Here's another point. History, at least when it's well written, is universal. This not only means that it appeals to people of all cultures, but people of all eras. Therefore, and that is the second caveat to keep in mind, one must read history not only to know about the past, but to become aware of the mistakes that those who came before us made. It is, then, one might argue, an endeavor of forming patterns of human behaviors, actions, decisions, and trying to formulate some sort of explanation for them. As a result, we need history to understand what led to our present, and subsequently what may happen in the future. History also allows us to appreciate our current advantages. It's not only about mistakes. There are many technologies and discoveries that we use and have proven to be of benefit to us that people who came before did not have. By reading history, one acquires a basis, By reading history, one acquires a basis for comparison and will therefore be more grateful for the things that make modern lives easier, but are often taken for granted. Now we come to the type of questions you should ask of a history book, which, recall, are a major aspect of analytical reading. If you don't ask questions, you'll probably find little or no answers. Historical texts, for the most part, can be treated as expository works. But the questions need slight modifications. The first question, what is the book about, remains essentially the same. But you should also concern yourself with what it is not about. A writer, any writer, not just a historian, cannot be blamed for not attempting to answer something he or she never claimed to tackle in the first place. The next questions deal with structural organization. How the work is divided as a whole is important in a historical work because it better grounds the reader. Is the book divided chronologically? Is it divided based on, say, economic, then political, and lastly, social factors? Or is it a collection of differing viewpoints, right? Arranged perhaps from the most conservative to the most liberal arguments? There are many options, available to a historian. And knowing the structure of their work aids in better analyzing the text. Okay, when assessing works of history, it's useful to note its dual nature, which we've already touched upon. Okay, history straddles a fine line between fiction, or if not fiction, at least storytelling, right? It's a narrative, and its more scientific part. Okay, the collection and analysis of pertinent sources. Criticism needs to be two-pronged, but arguably the latter part is the more important one. Okay, the science part. It is one thing if a historian seems dry in his or her storytelling, or has an excessively cynical outlook on human nature. But it is entirely another if said historian bases his or her analysis on inappropriate, insufficient, or irrelevant sources. As always, criticism should come only after a solid understanding of the material and argument has been attained. Okay. This brings us to the final question in this section. What of it, right? The practical ramifications of history need little introduction. It's safe to assume that most people operating in the political realm have at least some knowledge of history. History describes what did happen and therefore describes what may again happen or what may be avoided. History has the power to change the course of entire nations, and as such, reading it analytically, especially with regard to the what of it question, is essential. When reading biographies, it is useful to remember that many of the strategies that apply to history also apply to them. Every author of a biography has his or her agenda, so knowing their approach angle, so to speak, can help you in your analysis. Also, keep in mind that biographies, despite usually revealing aspects of a person's private life, are written for the general public. Because of the author's specific agenda, and because all works are ultimately flawed, you cannot expect to really know a person simply by reading his or her biography, no matter how detailed and accurate. What about autobiographies? Here's what the authors of How to Read a Book have to say on this matter, and I quote, "If it is difficult to know the life of anyone else, it is even more difficult to know one's own." Page 246. I love that quote, and I had to include it. So when writing a story of one's own life, one is tempted to either fabricate or conceal. Still, an autobiography always reveals something, even if that something is how keen the author was on concealing his or her shortcomings. In a sense, one can argue that all books are autobiographical, since there is no such thing as complete objectivity, and all written works have a certain style, which often stems from the author's personality. One final hint to keep in mind when reading both biographies and autobiographies is not to dig so deeply that you miss what is being plainly said. Finally, we come to current events. Many of the challenges pertaining to history are also present here, especially concerning facts. Are we getting all of them? Are any of them misrepresented? No. Here are 5 questions a keen reader or listener of news should ask. And I've taken these 5 things from these 5 questions from page 250. 1. What does the author or reporter, my edition, want to prove? 2. Whom does he want to convince? 3. What special knowledge does he assume? 4. What special language does he use? 5. Does he really know what he's talking about? Okay, end quote. There's also an additional challenge rather unique to current events. When analyzing them, we're missing an important advantage. Time. Okay, time. We lack hindsight. And so to understand the world around us as best we can, we must not only be aware of the workings of, say, the reporter's mind, but also our own. What triggers us? What words arouse strong emotions in us that might cloud our judgment? Armed with this knowledge, it is now time to move on to the next chapter, which deals with reading math and science. See you in the next video. We meet again, my wonderful viewers. So, this is part 3, chapter 17 of How to Read a Book, titled How to Read Science and Mathematics. So, before the kickoff of this chapter, it's important to note that, especially in the field of science, the tendency nowadays is to see work written by experts for experts. Okay, lay people are often given second thought, if at all. The chief advantage of this is speed, right? Knowledge is transmitted more efficiently. The drawback is equally obvious, right? A reader, even a reasonably learned one, stands little chance at understanding increasingly esoteric texts. So what does one to do? The trick here is to resort to popular writings, but to be able to distinguish between well-written and poorly written ones. Once you've identified these accessible works, the main takeaway from this chapter is this. Become aware of the problem the scientist or mathematician is trying to solve, and also become aware of that problem's background. This rule is not new, as understanding the author's contention is necessary to all expository works. Nonetheless, it is absolutely imperative in these fields. What is meant by scientific works here is, and I quote, the report of findings or conclusions in some field of research, whether carried on experimentally in a laboratory or by observations of nature in the raw. Page 258. Although such works are less biased than others, there's always some assumption carried out, at least before research starts. There's nothing inherently wrong or unexpected about that, so long as the scientist makes these presuppositions clear, or the mathematician. Scientific argumentation can be both deductive and inductive. We've talked about these before, and poses a challenge to anyone unfamiliar with the background of an experiment or observation. While it's true that the world, and therefore the writing used to express it, has become more complex, more tools are now available to the at the average person's disposal, such as Wikipedia and YouTube. These and other websites can aid the curious reader in garnering the necessary background information that allows him or her to better comprehend the ideas of a certain text. Okay, we now move on to math. It helps, especially for those who dislike it, to view math as a language, right? Replete with symbols and relationships between those symbols, quite, or not unlike words. There is a simplicity to math that, if truly appreciated, can make navigating its concepts easier than that of other disciplines. To illustrate, there is little room for ambiguity, okay? Almost no room for emotion and consequently irrationality, okay? Problems are often limited and clear in nature, and so on. To add, a deep understanding of math can help in most, if not all, expository works, as argumentation is noticeably similar to that of mathematical reasoning, okay? So said very simply, if you understand how math works, you're in a good position, or you're in a better position to understand how an argument written with words works. Okay, you'll encounter math in books that fall in one of two main categories. Science books that contain math, and math books proper. For the first scenario, there's nothing shameful in skipping some pages or merely looking at the results part of the sections that deal with math. However, if your intention is to read a purely mathematical book, then it needs mentioning that it must be read wholly. And while notes are useful in other works, they are indispensable when it comes to math. Having a scratch pad nearby might prove most useful. Remember that for both math and science, your aim as a layperson is not to become an expert on the matter discussed, but to understand the problem the writer is tackling. Lastly, keep in mind that whenever you opt for a simplified version of things, you are invariably at the mercy of whoever it was that did the diluting, right? With that in mind, here's a summary of previously discussed rules that particularly apply to math and science, taken from page 268. I quote, identify the subject matter, discover the relation between the whole and its parts, come to terms and plot the propositions and arguments, work at achieving understanding before you begin to criticize or assess significance, end quote. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Hi, welcome back to my channel, all about book summaries. We are doing How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. We are still on part 3, chapter 18, and it's titled How to Read Philosophy. Okay, so you should expect this to be dense, and it is, okay? Not so much in my summary, okay? It was, it's pretty reasonable. But in the actual book, and this is understandable, right? Mortimer J. Adler is a philosopher himself. He's written many books for the everyday person on philosophy. He has a book titled Aristotle for Everyone, and others, I'm sure. So yeah, if you're especially interested in philosophy, I really recommend buying the whole book and reading this section. Anyway, I've done my best here to give you the meat of it. Okay, so philosophy starts in childhood, at least the aspect of philosophy that has to do with wonder and the asking of profound questions. Children, however, cannot answer such questions. They can only ask them. It takes a special kind of person, a special type of adult, to pose childlike questions yet come up with adult answers. Asking the right questions serves a dual purpose. It forces one to become a more active reader or listener, you know what you're targeting, and it helps one to recognize answers when they do reveal themselves. Okay, so asking merely for information is not enough. Why types of questions are also important, and these are noticeably missing in most school curricula. They teach us the what in school, right? What is this, and when do you use it? Rarely do they tell us why, right? Why are you learning this or that? So questions of this type aid us in reaching simple distinctions to otherwise complicated phenomena. Okay, not unlike science and math, most modern philosophers do not write for the general public, okay, but for other experts. So in that case, in that regard, they're not unlike science and math writers, unfortunately. So when attempting to read philosophy, you need to keep in mind that there are first order questions, those that deal with what is or what happens, and second order questions, queries concerning the language used to express first order questions, among other concerns. Okay, and I've taken paraphrased this from page 276. Okay, modern, so post 1930 philosophers tend to tackle second order questions, which are difficult for non-philosophers. Okay, remember, second order questions are questions concerning the language used to express first order questions. And first order questions are questions that deal with what is or what happens. Ideally, and at least when starting out, a reader should opt for philosophy books dealing with first order questions. Okay, especially in the case of philosophy, I really recommend that you start chronologically, right? Start from the ancient Greeks and, and move from there. Anyway, when reading a book on philosophy, it's important to be aware of the philosophical method. Briefly stated, philosophers cannot experiment or devise questionnaires, okay? Basically, all they have is their mind. They can merely think. They do not guess, they do not speculate, but think profoundly. And their experiences can be understood by anyone who has been alive long enough. So if experiences are the same for everyone or can be acquired by anyone, what's the difference between a philosopher and a non-philosopher? Simply put, the philosopher has usually spent a great deal of time contemplating a certain conundrum. There may be one philosophical method, but there are 5 common philosophical styles, at least in the Western world. And here they are. A. The philosophical dialogue. The chief exponent of this style was Plato, and he used it to marvelous effect. Okay. However, he was arguably the only one to use it effectively, at least according to Adler, though others have tried. So at once you see its limitation, right? It's very effective, but only in the hands of a few. B. The philosophical treatise or essay. This style would not be unfamiliar to anyone who's finished high school or even middle school. The philosopher states a problem, and the paper goes through a beginning, middle, and end in an attempt to answer that problem. Some philosophers include counterpoints made by both lay people and other philosophers. C. The meeting of objections. Okay. This is a style honed by Thomas Aquinas. It was introduced in the Middle Ages and essentially straddles the major facets of the previous styles, that of posing questions and responding to counter-arguments. So he sort of took from both. Here's a quote from the book. The idea that the truth somehow evolves out of opposition and conflict was a common medieval one, page 283. And Aquinas, embraced this outlook. Okay, this D, the systemization of philosophy. This system was the brainchild of 2 notable 17th century philosophers, René Descartes and Baruch Spinoza. Okay, I don't know his last name. Inspired by the orderliness of math, they sought to organize philosophy in a similar manner to the way math is structured. This style, especially in Spinoza's case, was short-lived, and it's situational at best, right? I mean, math is math, philosophy is philosophy. Okay, the final one, E, the aphoristic style. An aphorism is, I quote from dictionary.com, a terse saying embodying a general truth or astute observation. Okay, this mostly Eastern style was adopted by Friedrich Nietzsche and others in the 19th century. The advantage of this style is that the reader does most of the work, okay, since the sayings are so short that it forces one to dig further. That having been said, this brevity is at once the appeal and the weak point of this style. It robs the reader of the ability to follow the philosopher's train of thought, and hence there's little to build on or argue against. And so, these are the predominant styles of philosophy, very briefly. Okay, let's move on. Knowing the author's problem or problems is usually a priority in any text, at least in expository works. But this point requires reiteration in the case of philosophy. Philosophers may explicitly or implicitly state what it is they wish to tackle, but in either case, you as a reader must be aware of what is being discussed. Okay? If you're not, you're gonna be lost. And there's no point in reading a work of philosophy if you don't know what the philosopher is tackling. A reader needs, in addition, to be aware of a philosopher's controlling principles, or what major aspect of his or her philosophy is taken for granted or assumed. Also, keep in mind that even the most competent philosophers tend to be inconsistent in applying their own controlling principles. More often than not, these are implicit rather than explicit, and it's important to keep an open mind when searching for them, even when, or perhaps especially when, they contradict your own assumptions. Here's another pertinent quote from the book, taken from pages 289 and 290. It is a good mental exercise to pretend that you believe something you really do not believe. And the clearer you are about your own prejudgments, the more likely you will be not to misjudge those made by others. End quote. When reading philosophy, it is especially tempting to resort to summaries and the like. Okay? However, these will almost always fall short, in the sense that they will not offer the satisfaction that comes from reading and rereading such texts and arriving at your own conclusions. When writing a philosophical work, an author does nothing but think, relying on his or her own experiences and the power of the intellect. Therefore, and not only as a matter of courtesy, a reader should also engage in deep thinking and not pluck ready-made answers. I quote, "Taking the opinions of others is not solving philosophical questions, but evading them." Page 291. One other important thing to note is that philosophers, although they use everyday speech, do so in a particular way. Just because you know a word or think you know it does not mean that your work is finished. Philosophers use common words in a way that suits their philosophy or argument, and it is imperative that one takes special care when understanding these terms. Also, keep in mind that philosophers have engaged in conversation with each other, so to speak, for centuries. It would do you good to read chronologically arguments on a specific topic. At the very least, read more than one philosopher's take on a matter before coming to a conclusion. Do not be put off by major disagreements between them. Some matters are unsolvable, and by noting these disagreements, you will become more aware of them. Furthermore, whether they agree or disagree is how do I put this? Is besides the point. Okay, let's put it that way. Okay, it shouldn't matter to you. You need to reach your own conclusions. Okay, with that, the summary of this chapter ends, and we now move on to the next chapter where we talk about social science. Hi, welcome back to my channel, all about book summaries. We're doing how to read a book. We're on part 3, chapter 19, how to read social science. Social science includes disciplines such as anthropology, archaeology, sociology, psychology, political science, and economics. Keep in mind that many of these divisions are arbitrary. Okay, some are grouped according to purpose, like what candidates are expected to do once they've acquired their degrees. Other institutions group them according to approach or technique, and still others compartmentalize these disciplines in terms of general concept versus specific theme, and so on. Okay, so if you're confused about what exactly constitutes social science, okay, you're not alone. The authors warn that although seemingly easy to read, social science is deceptive. Granted, it is familiar, certainly, but not easy, as the terms often employed, such as society, are recognizable but often have a myriad of meanings. There's also the paradox of social science. Because it is more accessible, most people tend to have tend to have strong opinions on the subject matter. And since that is the case, these opinions tend to color their reading, making true understanding rare. I quote, you cannot understand a book if you refuse to hear what it is saying. Page 301. Another challenge is that of terms. Recall that these are keywords or phrases that an author is using in specific contexts, and it is your job to make sure you fully comprehend them. Otherwise, you risk poorly understanding, or worse, misunderstanding the author's argument. Now, in the case of, say, the hard sciences, like physics, defining propositions is relatively straightforward, right? The concept of force, for instance, is understood by all, right? Physicists and non-physicists alike. Well, maybe not understood, right? But you know what I mean, right? A basic understanding is there between both scientist and layperson. The same cannot be said for terms such as mental health, adequate governance, even gross national product, right? So this difficulty then is not only a challenge for the writer, but for the reader as well. Remember that the first question you need to answer when pigeonholing a book is, what kind of book is it? Given that the subcategories of social science are not agreed upon in the first place, and given the tendency of social science to straddle several disparate disciplines, often simultaneously, answering this question can prove rather difficult. Okay? That having been said, classifying a book of social science according to category is important. It will aid you in understanding its layout and will help you know the conventions it follows, which in turn allows for a fair assessment of the work at hand. Remember, this is the primary reason why we pigeonhole a book, right? Why we classify it. Okay? You must understand where it's coming from so that you can ask reasonable questions of it and judge it accordingly. Okay, moving on. Outlining a work of social science is typically a straightforward matter, but try not to jump to conclusions when tackling the what of it part. Remember not to let opinions get in the way of understanding and analysis. Last point, we move on to one's approach when it comes to reading the vast body of literature that comprises social science. As this is a relatively new field, right, haven't been given official status only as recently as the 19th century, there are few, if any, classics, right, i.e. authoritative works that are generally agreed upon. Therefore, when a reader wishes to explore a topic, he or she often needs to read several different texts, although this is true of other disciplines, though to a lesser extent. Okay, with this comes the end of part 3, and this final chapter also serves as a springboard to the next, that of syntopical reading, as the authors call it, where you compare and contrast the contents of more than one text. Don't go away, we're almost done. Okay, we are back, and we start part 4 of How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. Part 4 is labeled The Ultimate Goals of Reading. We are on chapter 20, and it is titled The Fourth Level of Reading, Syntopical Reading. So far, the summaries have revolved around the reading of books in isolation, right? In other words, we're treating each book as one entity to be analyzed. However, most profound inquiries require the reading of more than one book, and there's also the challenge of deciding which of these to read. Alrighty, so one way to overcome this is to try and limit the subject you're interested in or asked to research about. Okay, so love, for instance, is far too broad, but, I quote, fiction writing on love from one man to another in 16th century British literature does not seem so arduous a task anymore. Okay, make no mistake though, this is still challenging work if you were to choose such a topic. Quite often you can only truly understand whether two or more works are related only after you have read them and not before. So back to our example of 16th century British literature. Even such a limited topic will likely yield a vast array of texts. So this is where the second level of reading comes into use. Recall that first you should skim a book and then read it superficially. Give that no more than an hour. By doing that, you'll have an understanding, albeit a shallow one, of the contents of the books. And you will also have cut down your bibliography to a more manageable size. Remember that, as mentioned in a previous chapter, One of the pillars of successful reading is knowing what to read at what speed. Time is often wasted on texts that do not require careful reading, while not enough time is given to worthy books or worthy sections of those books. When classifying, it is important to not only identify what kind of book it is, but whether it might potentially be useful in the future or not. Only practice and experience can help here, as each person's project, interests, research parameters, you name it, everyone's situation is different. Okay, you should also avoid multitasking. Okay, this is an important point here. One common mistake is to try and blend the second and third stages of reading by attempting to analyze everything you're inspecting. Okay, aim for quality rather than quantity and avoid haste by breaking tasks down and tackling them accordingly. Okay, as I said before in one of the earlier videos, our brains are not designed for multitasking. Okay, so if you're trying to read, understand, and analyze at the same time, you're bound to do none of these well. Okay, there are 5 steps to syntopical reading. Let's start. Step 1. Find relevant passages. The whole book will not be relevant to the question you are seeking. You must therefore identify passages that suit your purposes. Try not to cut corners and do this step at the same time you're shortlisting the books. Do not do that, okay? One thing at a time. Remember that in syntopical reading you're making connections, so the author's original aim of the book may not necessarily help. I quote, "When you read a book analytically, you put yourself in a relation to it of disciple to master. When you read syntopically, you must be the master of the situation." Page 318. Step 2. Bringing the authors to terms. This step is perhaps the most challenging. Okay? Recall that in analytical reading, you must come to terms with an author. But when you read syntopically, it is unlikely that all authors use all terms uniformly. It is you, therefore, who must establish your terms and place the author's ideas under those umbrellas. The different authors may not have had your device problem in mind. Okay? More often than not, they won't, right? Otherwise, what's the point of you writing about it? And so it is up to you to make sense of multiple texts. Step 3. Get the questions clear. We're not only defining terms here, but establishing propositions as well. To that end, a clear set of questions ought to be put in place, where each is answered by one or more of the authors being read. The challenge here is to make these questions answerable by all authors, but since they may not originally have had part or all of them in mind, right? So part of those questions or all of those questions in mind, it is no easy task. Sometimes an author may have nothing explicit to say. In this case, we must, with caution, attempt to infer what he or she would have said. The order of the questions will vary based on subject, but a general guideline can be established. Typically, one starts with, and I quote, "the existence or character of the phenomenon or idea we are investigating." Page 320. The next set of questions deals with, I quote, "how the phenomenon is known or how the idea manifests itself." Page 320. Finally, one often explores, and I quote, "the consequences of the answers to the previous questions." Page 320. Step 4. Defining the issues. Rarely is an issue worth investigating simple, i.e. it seldom has 2 clear-cut opposing answers. Given that there are usually several types of answers when one is examining a topic syntopically, it is up to the reader to group them in a way that makes sense. To further complicate matters, authors may not only have varying views, but varying conceptions altogether. Here, it is an issue not of opposition, but of a different understanding or approach altogether. The reader needs to frame the question in such a way that it encompasses all views appropriately. Step 5. Analyzing the discussion. The first 4 steps help us answer the previously established questions. What does the book say? And how does it say it? Step 5 aids us in coming up with answers to the questions, is it true? And what of it? The task of a syntopical reader is not necessarily to find a definitive answer. In fact, doing so for most issues is virtually impossible. Instead, one must look for a new perspective on a topic, one that combines all opposing viewpoints, each with their own merits. This new truth, then, consists of structuring relevant assertions, not haphazardly, but in an ordered manner that can be justified. In essence, one is elucidating the dimensions of a problem in the hope that someone, perhaps, but not necessarily the writer, him or herself, may make sense of one day. So, and the 5 steps. Note that disagreement does not always need to be present for intellectual discussion to take place. Rarely is an author fully in one camp or the other. Typically, several authors you have shortlisted will hold many opposing viewpoints. A truth may be divided into many truths. Each opinion may hold a portion of the truth and may not be fully correct all the time and in all situations. Sometimes, all current opinions may be false, awaiting a new opinion to emerge, one that is closer to the answer. The job of the syntopical reader, as mentioned, is not to discover the truth, right? But to bring together several pertinent opinions and organize them in a way that makes sense. He or she, and I quote, tries to look at all sides and to take no sides. Page 324. No person will succeed in being fully objective, but it is an ideal that one must strive for nonetheless. By the way, bias need not be explicit judgment, but can manifest itself, and I quote, in a variety of subtle ways, by the manner in which arguments are summarized, by shades of emphasis and neglect, by the tone of a question or the color of a passing remark, and by the order in which the various different answers to key questions are presented. Pages 324 to 325. One useful tool here is to refer back to textual evidence, to present readers with the author's own language in a way that is fair, i.e. not taken out of context. For an example of syntopical reading, if you get the book, see pages 325 to 329, or if you already have it. All right, let's move on. Syntopical reading involves a paradox. I quote, unless you know what books to read, you cannot read syntopically. But unless you can read syntopically, you do not know what to read. Page 329. You might think that asking a person who knows about the field you wish to inquire about might be the solution. But, more often than not, such a person will not only tell you what to read, but how to read it. And that's the dangerous bit. In other words, this person will color your perception of the topic, limiting your scope and your thinking even before you've begun your research. The author suggests consulting the Syntopicon, a then revolutionary accomplishment that aimed to be for ideas what dictionaries are for words. And if you recall, or if you if you watched my overview, I talked about that. I really feel for Adler. He spent 10 years and like $10 million, working on this. Unfortunately, and despite a 1990 revision, the Syntopicon has fallen into obscurity. Reasons cited were the assumptions of Adler and others that logic and only logic is needed for understanding a book. And the fact that only content is important, that form, should be discarded. Furthermore, the work was unabashedly biased toward Western writings. In fact, biased may be an understatement, as the works included in the Syntopicon were exclusively written by Western writers, right? I should point out that the authors anticipated many of these contentions and others and provided counter-arguments to them on pages 333 to 335. In retrospect, of course, we know that these have sadly been in vain, right? And again, I say sadly because Adler, who spearheaded the project, and his team spent over a decade compiling the Syntopicon, and it must have been crushing for him to see his efforts come to nothing. That having been said, and despite the overall failure of the Syntopicon, we, the people living today, have tools and resources available to us that were the stuff of dreams as recently as 2 or 3 decades ago. Okay, we now have Google Books, the Google search engine, online forums, useful websites, online databases, you name it, right? So in this day and age, there's really no excuse. There's really no excuse not to amass different texts on similar topics. Okay, regardless of the Syntopicon's reception, being able to compare and contrast two or more related texts, to organize them and make sense of their essence is vital to becoming an independent thinker. Below is a summary I've taken from pages 335 to 336 of what was discussed in this chapter, which has admittedly been difficult to summarize. Okay, we start. I start my quoting from pages 335 to 336. 1. Create a tentative bibliography of your subject by recourse to library catalogs, advisors, and bibliographies in books. 2. Inspect all of the books on the tentative bibliography to ascertain which are germane to your subject and also to acquire a clearer idea of the subject. 3. Inspect the books already identified as relevant to your subject in order to find the most relevant passages. 4. Bring the authors to terms by constructing a neutral terminology of the subject that all or the great majority of the authors can be interpreted as employing, whether they actually employ the words or not. 5. Establish a set of neutral propositions for all of the authors by framing a set of questions to which all or most of the authors can be interpreted as giving answers, whether they actually treat the questions explicitly or not. 6. Define the issues, both major and minor ones, by ranging the opposing answers of authors to the various questions on one side of an issue or another. You should remember that an issue does not always exist explicitly between or among authors, but that it sometimes has to be constructed by interpretation of the author's views on matters that may not have been their primary concern. 7. Analyze the discussion by ordering the questions and issues in such a way as to throw maximum light on the subject. More general issues should precede less general ones, and relations among issues should be clearly indicated. That is it. Thank you for listening. See you in the next video. Okay, hi. Wow, this is it. The last chapter. Chapter 21 of part 4. The book we're doing, obviously, is How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. Okay, this final chapter is titled Reading and the Growth of the Mind. This chapter brings us to the end of our summary. Perhaps the most important takeaway from this book is that if you do not ask questions, you'll not be supplied with answers. Recall also what was stated in a past chapter. If you agree with a practical book as this one is, then you need to take action. You need to make changes to your behavior, and in this case, read more actively. Okay, so whether you tackle books of fiction or non-fiction, or ones that are imaginative or expository, practical or theoretical, you must be constantly pushing yourself. Do not shy away from reading books that are at least slightly above your head, as Adler was keen on saying. You need to get out of your comfort zone in order to expand it slightly but surely with every new book you read. Note that, and this is especially true in our era, mere facts do not make you an independent thinker. You need to understand the various relationships related to those facts, where and when to apply them, reconcile them if need be. Facts do not help you form or pick apart logical arguments, nor do they help you become a critical thinker. Despite the wealth of information available requiring only an internet connection, wisdom has become ever scarcer, which goes to show that facts, at least in isolation, cannot liberate us intellectually, nor help us make sense of pressing and important matters. So what exactly makes a good book? A good book is one that rewards your efforts at analyzing it. The best books not only improve your reading skill, but also teach you about the world and yourself. Such books can offer true wisdom, because they often discuss matters to which no easy solutions can be reached, forcing you to think deeply about issues universal to all mankind. How do you recognize such books? According to the authors, a handful of books enlighten you once. After reading them, although you feel your knowledge has expanded, you can somehow tell that they have no more to offer. Of this handful, an even smaller portion belongs to the realm of great books, and these are books that contain such profound wisdom that they will keep you discovering new insights through them until the day you perish. At this chapter's conclusion, the actual books appendix has a list of such books. Although you need to keep in mind that not all books have the same effect on all readers. So, take the list with a grain of salt, especially since, like the Syntopicon previously mentioned, the texts are all Western ones. Okay? In case you're wondering, Appendix B gives you the chance to practice some of the suggestions given in this book. Oh, we're almost done. Such a bittersweet moment. I love this book. Though it's been quite a challenge summarizing and recording these. Yeah, I still don't want it to end. But here it is, the last paragraph I've written to share with you. There is an interesting test one can do to discover the books that interest him or her, and in turn discover oneself. If you were to be stranded on an island with nothing but 10 books, which would you choose? To close this chapter and the entire summary of this wonderful book, I, as well as the authors, would like to remind everyone that the brain is essentially a muscle. And just like any muscle, hey, use it or lose it, right? When it falls into disuse, it slowly begins to die. So to keep our brain and subsequently our mind alive and well, we must constantly be stretching it, okay, for it to continue to grow. Wow. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed my summary of the book. And if you've made it thus far, the only thing I can do is to sincerely thank you.